Tonight we explore what the Buddhist tradition calls the freedom that is available in every moment. It asks for one thing only, a moment of seeing. One clear moment in which the spinning of the mind is noticed for what it is. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. The whole of what the Buddha taught can be gathered into a single idea, from being lost inside a story to waking up from it. That shift can happen in an instant. It does not change the facts of a life. It changes the relationship to those facts so completely that everything feels different, even though nothing has moved. Wherever you are tonight, let the body settle. There is nothing to figure out, nothing to hold on to, nothing to fix. The mind may keep turning for a while, and that is fine. Let the stories and teachings settle in, like rain falling into soft earth. Thank you for joining us here at Midnight Monk. Let us begin. A Buddhist philosopher was once asked if he could describe the entire human experience in just a few words. He said he could do it in 3. Lost in thought. 3 words, and yet they hold so much. Lost in thought. That is where most of us spend most of our lives. The mind wanders into a memory and replays it. It drifts toward next week and begins to worry. It picks up a conversation from hours ago and rewrites it, and then rewrites the rewrite. All of this happens automatically, without permission. And the strange thing is, it feels like thinking. It feels productive. It feels like the mind is working on something important. But most of the time it is simply spinning. Tonight we begin with that spin, because seeing it clearly is the first step toward freedom. In an old river city, there lived a cloth merchant who had spent his life building a steady, respected trade. He was known for his honesty, for the quality of his dyes, and for the care he took with his customers. His days had a rhythm that suited him, and he was, by most accounts, a contented man. Then one spring, a letter arrived from the capital. A trading house there, a large and distinguished one, needed someone trustworthy to manage its affairs. The offer was extended to this merchant on the recommendation of a mutual friend. It was, by any measure, a great honor. And that was where the trouble began. The merchant read the letter again and again. He sat with it at his workbench. He carried it folded in his sleeve on walks along the river. His mind turned the offer over as he might turn a bolt of cloth, examining every thread. If he accepted, he would have to leave his home, travel a great distance, learn the customs of a new city, and manage a house full of strangers. The roads were long. The capital was crowded. He would have to start over in a place where no one knew his name. The thought of it exhausted him before he had packed a single bag. But if he declined, what then? The friend who had recommended him would be embarrassed. The owners of the trading house might take offense. And he himself would have to live with the knowledge that he had been offered something remarkable and turned it away out of fear. The shame of it settled in his chest like a stone. So he worried. He worried about accepting, and he worried about declining. He worried about the journey, and he worried about staying. Every path his mind walked ended in a thicket of difficulty. And every evening, after hours of this, he was no closer to a decision but much further from peace. His wife noticed. His apprentice noticed. A friend suggested he take longer walks in the morning to calm himself. Another recommended a particular tea known for settling the nerves. A third, a fellow of some spiritual inclination, urged him to double his time in prayer, to sit for an hour each morning instead of his usual half hour. The extra stillness will help, the friend assured him. The merchant tried all of it. He walked. He drank the tea. He sat for longer stretches each morning, eyes closed, breathing slowly. And each of these things brought a kind of temporary relief, the way a cool cloth on the forehead soothes a headache without curing the fever beneath it. He would feel calmer for an hour, sometimes two, and then the mind would pick up the letter again and resume its relentless examination. Finally, in some desperation, he climbed the hill above the city to visit an old hermit who lived in a small stone hut overlooking the river. The hermit was known for his plain-spoken wisdom, though he rarely offered advice unless asked directly. The merchant sat down on the packed earth outside the hut and told his story. The whole tangled thing. The letter, the honor, the fear of going, the shame of staying, the tea, the walks, the extra prayer. He laid it out as honestly as he could, and when he finished, he looked at the hermit with eyes full of hope and fatigue. The hermit listened without interrupting. Then he stood and led the merchant around to the back of the hut, where a small stone mill sat beside a stream. A wooden water wheel turned slowly in the current, and the millstone turned with it, grinding against the base with a low, continuous rumble. The water flowed. The wheel turned. "What do you hear?" the hermit asked. "A millstone grinding," the merchant said. "Look closer." The merchant looked. The wheel turned, but the hopper above was empty. There was no grain in the mill. The stream kept the wheel turning, hour after hour, day and night, and the stone was grinding against nothing at all. "Your mind is this mill," the hermit said. "It is working very hard. The wheel never stops. But there is no grain in it, and no amount of walking, or tea, or sitting with your eyes closed will change that." The merchant stared at the millstone for a long time. "Tell me," the hermit said, "all these evenings of turning the letter over, how much flour do you have?" The merchant opened his mouth, then closed it. "None," the hermit said, "because there was never any grain. Only the sound of grinding, which you took for progress." This is the first teaching of the evening. When the mind is caught in what might be called a no-win loop, every branch of the future looks painful. Accept the offer and suffer the difficulty. Decline it and suffer the shame. The mind examines both outcomes and finds trouble in each, and so it cycles back to the beginning and examines them again. This is what the Buddhist tradition calls the spin cycle of the mind, and there is no exit from inside it, because the spinning itself is the problem. Consider what the merchant's friends offered him. Every suggestion was kind and well-meaning. Walk more. Drink calming tea. Sit longer in the morning. And none of it was bad advice. But none of those remedies addressed the actual problem, which was that his mind had built a wheel and was running on it. There is a real difference between lowering the volume of stress and seeing its source. A calming practice can bring temporary relief, and that relief matters. It is good to feel less tense, good to discharge some of the restless energy, good to sit and breathe and let the nervous system settle. But if the habit underneath remains unseen, the mind will build the wheel again tomorrow. It will find the next letter, the next decision, the next ambiguous situation, and begin grinding. Comfort and insight are different medicines. Comfort eases the symptom. Insight sees the mechanism. And seeing the mechanism, as the hermit showed with his empty millstone, is the beginning of a different kind of freedom. This distinction matters because the worrying mind is very good at disguising itself as productive thinking. It mimics reason. It borrows the language of planning and analysis. It presents each new pass through the problem as though it were examining fresh information, when in fact it is running the same circuit with the same data, arriving at the same dead end, and generating the same distress all over again. The Buddhist teaching on this is precise. The mind does not just have a thought and move on. When a thought carries any emotional charge, the mind seizes it, examines it, compares it to past experience, projects it into the future, and before long a single impression has mushroomed into an elaborate and often painful story. The Pali word for this is papancha, which means something like mental proliferation, and it describes the way one thought leads to 10, and 10 to 100. And before you know it, a single worry about tomorrow has carried you all the way back to childhood, or all the way forward to a future that will never arrive. The merchant's case was a perfect example. One letter, one offer, one genuine question about what to do next. That was the grain, the real substance. But the mind took that single question and built a whole architecture of suffering around it, suffering that existed only in thought, only in projection, only in the spinning. The actual letter was just paper and ink. The mind made it into a prison. And the difficult truth is that no amount of calming down will undo that architecture. Calm helps. Calm is good. But a calm mind can still build the same wheel tomorrow, just more slowly. What breaks the cycle is the moment of seeing the wheel itself, recognizing that the grinding is producing nothing, that the hopper has been empty all along. There is a well-known exchange in the Chan tradition that carries this same teaching from a different angle. A young monk named Mazu Daoyi had built a small hermitage in the hills and was gaining a reputation as one of the most dedicated meditators in the region. He sat for hours each day. His discipline was extraordinary. His intention was clear and sincere. He wanted to become a Buddha. The master Nanyue Huairang, who lived nearby, heard about this young monk and went to see him. He found Mazu sitting perfectly still outside his hut, eyes closed, spine straight, settled deeply into his practice. "What are you doing?" Nanyue asked. "Sitting in meditation," Mazu replied, without opening his eyes. "And what do you hope to accomplish?" "To become a Buddha." Nanyue nodded and said nothing more. He picked up a piece of broken roof tile from the ground, sat down on a nearby rock, and began rubbing the tile vigorously against the stone. A harsh scraping sound filled the air. Mazu tried to ignore it. He settled back into his sitting. But the sound continued, minute after minute, grinding and scraping. Finally, he opened his eyes. "Master, what are you doing?" "Polishing this tile," Nanyue said calmly, continuing to rub. "And what do you hope to accomplish?" "To make a mirror." Mazu frowned. "How can you make a mirror by polishing a tile?" Nanyue stopped rubbing and looked at him. "And how can you become a Buddha by sitting in meditation?" The question hung in the mountain air. Mazu had no answer. After a pause, Nanyue said, "Suppose you are driving an ox cart and the cart stops moving. Do you whip the cart or do you whip the ox?" Mazu was silent. Something was changing inside him and he could feel it. Nanyue continued, "You are trying to learn to sit like a Buddha. But the Buddha has no fixed form. A Buddha is not a posture. If you cling to the form of sitting, you miss what sitting is for. And if you make awakening into a destination, you turn the path itself into a prison." This exchange, recorded in the lamp histories of the Chan tradition, became one of its most famous teachings. The tile cannot become a mirror no matter how hard you polish it. And the ox cart does not move because you whip the cart. You address the ox, the mind itself, the one who is doing the sitting. This is the same insight the hermit offered the merchant, arrived at from the opposite direction. The merchant was grinding without grain. Mazu was polishing without possibility. Both were working very hard at something that could never produce the result they hoped for, because the effort was aimed at the wrong place. And this is not a failure of sincerity. Mazu was as sincere as a person can be. The cloth merchant was agonizing precisely because he cared. The effort is real. The intention is real. What is missing is the seeing. The moment of stepping back just far enough to recognize what the mind is actually doing. When Nanyue asked about the ox cart, he was pointing to something very specific. The cart is everything external. The posture, the technique, the routine, the schedule, the extra 15 minutes in the morning. The ox is the mind itself, the living animal pulling the whole enterprise. And if the ox stops, whipping the cart will never get it moving again. You can refine the cart endlessly, add new wheels, polish the frame, oil the axle, and it will sit exactly where it is, because the problem was never the cart. This is what so many of us do with our inner lives. We adjust the conditions. We change the method. We try harder at the same approach, or we try a different approach with the same assumption underneath, that the solution is in the doing, in the technique, in the form. And sometimes the solution is there. Sometimes a better method does help. But when the real issue is the mind's relationship to its own activity, when the wheel itself is the problem, no refinement of method will touch it. Only seeing will touch it. The practice here is very simple, and it asks almost nothing. As the body rests tonight, there may be a wheel turning somewhere in the mind, a decision being examined for the 100th time, a conversation being replayed, a worry about tomorrow being turned over and over. If something like that is running, there is no need to stop it. Simply notice it as you might notice rain on a window. It is there. It is doing what it does. And you are here, aware that it is happening. That awareness, that small moment of seeing, is the grain that changes everything. The mind may keep grinding for a while, out of habit, out of momentum. That is fine. The seeing itself is already a different relationship with the spinning. It is already, in some small way, freedom. Let that be enough for now. Whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tibetan teacher Anam Thubten once described consciousness as being like a coin. On one side, delusion. On the other, enlightenment. We can flip our consciousness the same way that we flip a coin, he wrote, and when we do, the other side of our conditioned mind is enlightenment. And then he added something striking. There are only two states of consciousness. There is no third state. Two states. Here or lost in thought. Awake or dreaming with open eyes. and the distance between them is not a long road. It is a single flip. Something that takes, as Unhurried put it, just a millisecond. This is one of the most surprising things in the Buddhist teaching, that the movement from suffering to freedom does not require years or effort or any particular achievement. It requires a moment, one moment of seeing, and in that moment, everything can change without anything changing at all. In an old capital along a northern river, there lived an elderly woman who had been invited to the lantern ceremony at a temple on the far side of the city. It was deep winter, and the days were short, and by the time she set out, the light was already failing. She had planned to take the evening ferry across the river and walk the remaining distance, but when she arrived at the landing, the ferry was slow. The river was high with winter rain, and the crossing took twice as long as she had expected. By the time she stepped off onto the far bank, she was already late. The ceremony would begin soon, and a friend was waiting for her at the temple gate. So she set off walking, quickly, through the cold streets. And the mind began. The ferry took too long. The boatman should have left earlier. Now the ceremony will be half over by the time you arrive. Your friend will worry. She will think something has happened. You should have left the house sooner. Why did you not leave sooner? And these streets are so dark, and the wind is so bitter, and your shoes are not the right shoes for this pace. On and on it went, one complaint threaded to the next like beads on a string. The ferry, the timing, the friend, the shoes, the cold. Each thought arrived as if it were solving something, as if this running commentary on everything going wrong would somehow make things go right. And the woman walked faster, her breath sharp in the cold air, the complaints growing louder in her mind with every step. And then, somewhere between one street and the next, she heard herself. Oh, she thought, listen to me. All this grumbling, that was all. One small observation, one moment of catching the sound of her own mind. And in that instant, something flipped. She was still walking. The cold had not changed. The ceremony was still happening without her. Her friend was still waiting. Every fact was identical to the moment before. But she was no longer inside the complaint. She was standing slightly apart from it, looking at it, and what she saw was not a disaster, but something remarkable. Here she was, an old woman, walking alone through a winter night, strong enough to stride through the cold, bound for lantern light, and a friend, and a ceremony that someone had thought to invite her to. Her life had brought her to this moment, with these legs that still carried her, in a city still standing, on a night where lanterns were being lit. How extraordinary. How completely, absurdly fortunate. She did not slow down. If anything, she walked taller. But the grumbling had stopped, and in its place was something that could only be called wonder. The same facts, the same night, the same cold wind, and yet everything was different because the lens had turned. This is the moment the entire episode circles around. One instant of noticing, and the world rearranges itself. Nothing moved. Nothing was fixed. The ferry was still slow, the streets still cold, the ceremony still underway. And yet the experience of all of it changed completely, because the woman saw what her mind was doing and, in that seeing, stepped out of it. This is what unhurried means by flipping the coin. The grumbling side and the grateful side are both printed on the same moment. They share the same facts, the same body, the same winter night. The only difference is which face is showing. And the flip takes no effort. It takes a millisecond. It takes one breath of awareness, one small, oh, there is something in us that resists this. It seems too easy. Valuable things, the mind insists, should be earned. They should take time. There should be a process, a method, stages of development. And yet the tradition is very clear on this. Freedom is always one moment away. Always. In any situation, at any age, after any length of being lost. The coin is always ready to be turned. Think of it as pressing the clear button on a calculator. It does not matter how tangled the numbers have become, how many operations have piled on top of each other, how far past the limit the display has gone. One press, and the screen is fresh. Not because the previous work was undone, but because a new beginning has no obligation to carry the old tangle forward. That clear button is available at any time. The only question is whether we remember to press it. And here is what makes the woman's story so important. The noticing was not something she achieved. It was something that arose. She did not sit down and meditate. She did not apply a technique. She did not even intend to wake up. She was in the middle of complaining, fully caught, fully absorbed in the story of everything going wrong. And then, for no particular reason, she heard herself. That is all. One moment of hearing. This is what the tradition means when it says that the transformation requires no effort. Effort implies a distance to be crossed, a gap between where you are and where you need to be. But the woman was already there. The presence she discovered was not somewhere she needed to travel to. It was where she was standing the entire time, hidden by nothing more than the sound of her own commentary. What changed was not her location but her attention. The commentary did not stop because she fought it. It stopped because she noticed it, and in the noticing, she was no longer inside it. She was beside it, above it, free of it, just by seeing it for what it was. The facts had not changed, and yet she was already on the other side of the coin. This is the wonder that lives inside the flip, the discovery that the same moment, seen from even slightly outside the mind's narration, is already full, already complete, already worth marveling at. The grumbling mind sees only what is wrong, only what is missing, only what has failed to match its expectations. But the moment itself, stripped of commentary, is simply what it is, and what it is, more often than we realize, is astonishing. A different kind of moment now, but carrying the same teaching. In the early years of his training, the young Japanese monk Dogen traveled to China to study at one of the great Chan monasteries. He was brilliant and deeply earnest, full of questions about the scriptures, hungry for insight, impatient to understand the deepest truths. His mind was sharp and it was busy, always working, always reaching for the next understanding. One afternoon, after the noon meal, he was crossing the monastery courtyard on his way to study when he came upon an old monk working in the open air. The man was bent over rows of flat tiles spread across the paving stones, turning mushrooms in the sun to dry them. The heat was fierce. The sun beat down on the old monk's bare head, and his back curved like a bow. His eyebrows were white as crane feathers. Dogen stopped. "How long have you been a monk?" he asked. 68 years, the old man said, without looking up. Dogen was astonished. 68 years. This was not some junior monk assigned to kitchen duties. This was one of the most senior members of the entire community, and here he was, stooped in the blazing sun, doing work that any assistant could have done. "Why do you not have someone younger do this for you?" Dogen asked. It seemed obvious. A monk of 68 years of service had earned the right to rest in the shade. The old cook straightened up just enough to look at him. "Others are not me," he said. Dogen did not quite understand. But surely, in this heat, could it not wait for a cooler day? "If not now, when?" the old cook said. He looked up at the sun, then back down at the mushrooms drying on their tiles. "This is the day. This is the heat. These mushrooms are ready now. Another day the weather will be different. Another hour the light will have moved. This is the moment for this work." And he bent back to his task. Dogen stood there for a long time after the old cook had returned to his turning. Something in the encounter had reached past all of his scholarly understanding and touched something simpler. All of his urgency to grasp the great truths, all of his reaching for enlightenment, all of his intellectual striving, and here was this old man with his white eyebrows doing the plainest work imaginable, and doing it with a completeness that made everything else feel like noise. "Others are not me. If not now, when?" The old cook was not philosophizing. He was not delivering a teaching. He was drying mushrooms. That was all. And in the wholeness of that act, in the simplicity of meeting one plain task with the full weight of his attention, he was more present than Dogen had been in weeks of study. The young scholar's world, with its texts and debates and urgent questions, suddenly looked like a very elaborate wheel, spinning fast and grinding nothing. The old cook was not spinning. He was not reaching for anything beyond the tiles in front of him. And in that refusal to reach, in that willingness to stay entirely with what was here, he had arrived at the very thing Dogen had been studying so hard to find. Dogen wrote about this encounter later in a text called the Tenzo Kyokun, a set of instructions for the monastery cook. It became one of the foundations of Zen practice. The deepest truth, it turned out, was not hidden in the scriptures. It was out in the courtyard, drying mushrooms in the afternoon sun, being done by a man who had long since stopped looking for it anywhere else. What makes the old cook's answer so striking is its completeness. "Others are not me." 4 words that close every escape route. You cannot delegate your own presence. You cannot hire someone to be awake on your behalf. The young monk who sweeps the courtyard is doing his sweeping, not the old cook's sweeping. The body that stands in the sun and turns the mushrooms is the same body that receives the heat, the same hands that feel the texture of the caps, the same attention that knows when each one is ready. No substitute can carry that. And, if not now, when? Closes the other door, the one marked later. The mind that delays presence to a more convenient moment will always find a reason to delay again. The conditions will never be perfect. There will always be heat, or cold, or tiredness, or something more important calling from the study hall. The old cook had learned, in 68 years, that the conditions are always exactly what they are, and that the moment for this work is always this moment. There is no other. The 2 stories of this module arrive at the same place from opposite ends. The woman striding through the winter night discovered freedom by accident, in a single flash of noticing. The old cook discovered it over 68 years of meeting each task whole, and yet the moment itself is the same. one person, fully here, fully present, the mind no longer running to the next thing. What is remarkable in both cases is how ordinary the moment is. There is no vision, no flash of light, no dramatic breakthrough. A woman walks through the cold. A man dries mushrooms. And these are the gates of freedom, because freedom is not found in extraordinary circumstances. It is found in the ordinariness of this breath, this step, this plain activity, when the mind stops narrating and simply arrives. Arnhem Thubten wrote, "If we hold a strong intention to let go of all of our thoughts, we can witness our consciousness changing, just like flipping a coin. This also happens whenever we focus our attention towards simple things or events in our immediate surrounding, like the flow of the breath, the sound of the breath. The flip happens when attention lands on something simple and immediate. The breath, the weight of the body, the sound of the room, the feel of cloth between the fingers. It does not require pushing anything away. It requires only arriving, for one moment, at whatever is here." The old cook knew this so well that it had become his entire life. He did not practice presence as a technique. He practiced it as mushrooms, as tiles, as heat. Each task was the whole of his attention, and each moment of that attention was the other side of the coin. Not a breakthrough, not a peak experience, just the ordinary world met without commentary. That is what 68 years of practice looks like. It looks like an old man in the sun, doing exactly what the moment asks, and nothing more. And this arriving can happen anywhere. Waiting in a line, sitting in a car that is not moving, lying awake in the middle of the night with a mind that will not rest, washing a cup, folding a blanket, listening to rain. These are not obstacles to presence. They are invitations to it. Each one is a moment where the coin can turn. Each one is a set of mushrooms waiting in the sun, asking only to be met. So tonight, there is nothing at all to do with this teaching. Nothing to practice, nothing to remember, nothing to achieve. But if, at some point in the stillness, you notice the mind running its familiar commentary, the planning, the replaying, the low hum of worry, see if the noticing itself changes anything. See if, just for a moment, the same facts look different from the other side of the coin. You might find that the room you are lying in, this same room, this same bed, this same night, looks a little different when the commentary pauses. You might find that the sound of your own breathing, heard without judgment, has a kind of completeness to it. You might find that this moment, this particular arrangement of body and breath and silence is enough, and that you were already here before you noticed. That is enough. That is everything. Rest here for a moment, and whenever you are ready, we will move on together. In the Pali language, the word for mindfulness is sati. It comes from a root that means to remember. This is a telling choice. The tradition does not describe awareness as something we build or manufacture. It describes it as something we remember. We forget, and then we remember. We wander, and then we come back. The whole of practice, in a sense, is this returning. The Zen master Bankei, speaking to his students centuries later, put it even more simply. He said that the original mind, the mind before it gets tangled in thought, is always present. It is never damaged by the wandering. It is never diminished by the forgetting. It is simply waiting, the way a room waits behind a closed door, whole and undisturbed, no matter how long the door has been shut. The moment of waking up, the flip we have been exploring, arrives as a gift. It comes when it comes. But what happens immediately after, the very next breath, the first response to the realization that the mind has been wandering, that is where the real practice begins. And this, more than anything else, is what determines whether freedom takes root or slips away. Because there are two ways to greet the moment of return, and they lead to very different places. In the records of the Zen tradition, there is an account of the master Sengai, who lived and taught in a monastery with a number of young monks in his care. One of these monks had developed a habit. Late at night, after the rest of the community was asleep, he would rise from his bed, carry a tall wooden stool to the far wall of the compound, set it against the stones, and climb over into the town beyond. There he would wander for hours, doing whatever it was that called to him outside the walls, and return before dawn. The other monks knew nothing of this. The night wanderer was careful. He always placed the stool in the same shadowed corner of the wall, always returned before the first bell, always arranged his bedding as though he had never left. But Sengai noticed. One evening, making his rounds through the sleeping hall, the master saw the empty bed. He did not wake anyone. He did not summon the senior monks. He simply walked to the far wall, found the stool standing in its usual place, and quietly removed it. Then he stood in the stool's place, there in the dark, and waited. Hours passed. The night was cold. The courtyard was still. The old master stood against the wall and did not move, his robes pulled around him, his breath slow in the winter air. Sometime deep in the night, the wandering monk returned. He climbed back over the wall, swung his legs down, and placed his feet on what he assumed was the stool. But it was not the stool. It was his teacher's head. The monk dropped to the ground and found himself looking into Sengai's face. For a terrible instant, the full weight of what had happened settled on him. He had been caught. He had been climbing over the wall for weeks, breaking the rules of the community, deceiving his brothers, and now here was his teacher, the person he respected most in the world, standing in the cold, having waited for him all night, having felt the soles of his sandals on the crown of his head. The monk opened his mouth but could not speak. Sengai looked at him. The master's face was calm. His eyes held no anger, no disappointment, no judgment. "It is very chilly in the early morning," Sengai said. "Do be careful not to catch cold." That was all. No lecture. No punishment. No mention of the broken rules. One sentence of kindness, spoken to a young man who had just stepped on his teacher's head. The monk never went over the wall again. Something happened in that encounter that goes far beyond discipline. The monk stopped his wandering, yes, but he stopped because of how he was met, not because of what was said. He was met at his worst moment, standing in the evidence of his deception, and what he found there was not rebuke but care. Not a lesson about what he had done wrong, but a concern for whether he might catch cold. This is the teaching at the heart of what we are exploring now, and it reaches directly into how we meet ourselves. Because every time the mind wakes up from a long stretch of wandering, whether in meditation or in daily life, there is a version of this encounter happening internally. You realize you have been gone. You see the evidence, the half hour lost to worry, the afternoon spent in a spiral, the weeks on autopilot. And in that instant of seeing, there is a fork, One path says, "There you go again. How many times do you have to make the same mistake? You will never learn. You will never change. What is wrong with you?" The other path says, "It is very chilly. Be careful." The first path feels productive. It feels honest. Surely, holding yourself accountable is the responsible thing to do. But look closely at what actually happens when the scolding voice takes over. The mind, having just woken up from one cycle of spinning, has now stepped directly into another. The self-criticism is itself a new wheel, grinding with the same empty energy as the one before it. The commentary about being a bad meditator is as much a departure from the present moment as the original wandering was. It is the spin cycle re-entering through the back door. The papancha we explored earlier, the endless proliferation of thought, does not only produce worry and catastrophe, it also produces judgment. It produces the story of the person who keeps failing. It produces the elaborate, detailed account of why this mind will never settle, why this person will never change, why the deck is stacked against them from the start. And all of this sounds like honesty. It sounds like self-awareness. But it is just the wheel, spinning in a new direction with the same empty hopper. The second path, the welcoming one, stays with the present. You are gone. Now you are here. That is all that matters. You are here, and this moment of being here again is, in a very real sense, the only moment in which practice actually happens. Every other moment was preparation for this one, or a forgetting of this one. This, right now, the return, is the work. There is a deeper version of this homecoming in one of the great parables of the Lotus Sutra, told by the Buddha's senior disciples after a moment of profound realization. The story is simple in its outline and vast in its meaning. A young man, many years ago, left his father's house. The reasons are lost. Perhaps he was restless. Perhaps he was angry. Perhaps he was simply young, and the world beyond the gate seemed larger and more interesting than the world within it. Whatever the cause, he left, and he did not come back. The father was wealthy and his house was full. He had servants and storerooms and land enough for many lifetimes. But his son was gone, and no wealth could fill the absence. Years passed. Decades. The father grew old. He never stopped watching the road. Meanwhile, the son wandered. He moved from city to city, taking whatever work he could find, sleeping in borrowed rooms and open fields, gradually forgetting the life he had left behind. The memory of his father's house grew dim, then faded entirely. He remembered only that he had always been poor, had always been a laborer, had always scraped by on whatever the world was willing to give him. The wealth he had been born into became something he could not even imagine, let alone claim. After many decades, by the workings of chance, the son's wandering path brought him to the outskirts of a great estate. He was looking for work, any work, something to earn his next meal. He approached the gate, and a strange feeling moved through him, something he could not name, a pull in the chest, a flicker of something older than memory. Inside the house, the father saw him. Even across the distance, even after all those years, a father knows his son. The old man's heart broke open with joy. He sent servants running to the gate. Bring him inside. Tell him this is his home. But when the servants reached the son and took hold of his arms, the young man panicked. He did not recognize them. He did not recognize the house. He saw only a great estate, grand and unfamiliar, and strangers seizing him for reasons he did not understand. He pulled free and ran. The father understood. He could see that his son had been away so long that he no longer knew who he was. The direct approach, the announcement that this was his home and his inheritance, would only frighten him further. So the father tried a different way. He sent servants, dressed plainly, to find the son and offer him humble work. Sweeping, carrying, the simplest labor, at modest pay, in a far corner of the grounds where the main house was barely visible. The son, desperate enough to accept any work, agreed. And so the homecoming began, but slowly, at the son's own pace. Over months and years, the father watched from a distance, heartbroken and patient. He saw his son sweeping the courtyards. He saw him carrying loads of earth. He saw him slowly gaining confidence, slowly standing a little taller, slowly beginning to trust the place that was already his. Gradually, the father offered him more responsibility. The son moved from the outer grounds to the inner courtyard, from the inner courtyard to the storerooms, from the storerooms to the management of the household. Each step was given gently, at the pace the son could bear. And at last, when the son had grown into someone who could receive the truth without fleeing from it, the father called him close. In the presence of the whole household, the old man said what had been true from the first moment: "You are my son. Everything I have is yours. It was always yours. You were never the laborer you believed yourself to be." The son looked around at the house that had been his home from birth. The gates he had entered as a stranger. The rooms he had swept as a servant. Everything he had earned slowly, step by step, had been his birthright all along. The Lotus Sutra's parable is vast enough to hold many readings. But tonight, in the context of what we have been exploring, one reading stands out: the return carries no penalty. However long the absence, however far the wandering, however thoroughly the son forgot who he was, the welcome was waiting. It was always waiting. The door was never locked, and the inheritance was never revoked. This is what makes Sengai's response to the wandering monk so powerful and so unusual. Most of us, faced with our own returns, act like the servants who seized the son at the gate. We rush in, we grab, we announce the truth with force. You were wrong. You should have known. What took you so long? And the result is the same as in the parable. The one who has just returned panics and runs again. But the father knew something that most of us forget. The return itself is the miracle. The fact that the son came back at all, after decades of forgetting, after a lifetime of believing he was someone else, is so remarkable that everything else can wait. The details can be sorted out later. The inheritance can be explained in time. For now, the only thing that matters is that he is here. And so it is with the mind that wakes up from wandering. After an afternoon lost in a spiral, after a week of running on autopilot, after years of living inside a story, the moment of return is always clean. It carries no record of the length of the absence. It does not require apology or explanation or self-punishment. It simply asks to be received. The difference between a practice that deepens over time and one that stalls out is often nothing more than this: how the return is greeted. If the greeting is harsh, the mind learns that waking up is painful, and it will be slower to wake up next time. If the greeting is warm, the mind learns that coming home is safe, and the returns will come more easily, more naturally, more often. A half second of inward warmth at the moment of return is a very small thing. but compounded over months and years, it builds an entirely different relationship with your own mind. It trains the habit of freedom. It teaches the heart that waking up is good news, that returning is cause for celebration, however small and private, and that there is no arrival in this life more important than the one that is happening right now. The Father in the Lotus Sutra understood something that most of us forget in the heat of our own self-judgment. The pace of the return belongs to the one returning. He could have announced the truth the moment his son appeared at the gate. He could have seized him, shown him the storerooms, recited the inheritance, and the son would have run. Because the truth, delivered faster than it can be received, becomes a threat. It overwhelms instead of welcoming. So the father waited. He let the son sweep. He let him carry. He let him find his footing, step by slow step, in a house that had always been his. And this patience was not a compromise. It was the deepest expression of love available, the willingness to let another person arrive at their own pace, in their own time, without forcing the recognition. This same patience is what the inward welcome requires. The mind that has been wandering for an afternoon, or a week, or a year, does not need to be confronted with the full weight of how long it has been gone. It needs a broom and a quiet corner. It needs the simplest possible task. It needs to hear, "You are here now," and nothing more. The rest of the inheritance will reveal itself in time, as readiness allows. And the beautiful thing about this parable, the detail that makes it luminous, is that the inheritance was never in danger. The son's wandering did not diminish it. His forgetting did not erase it. His decades of believing himself to be a stranger did not make him one. The wealth was waiting, untouched, for the entire duration of his absence. Nothing was lost except the knowledge that nothing had been lost. This warmth is not something that needs to be manufactured or performed. It can be as simple as a single breath, as simple as the silent recognition, here again. No fanfare, no big moment, just the acknowledgement that the mind was gone and now it is back, and that is enough. There is a saying from India that holds something of this same gentleness, along with a useful dose of humility. Even a 93-year-old saint is not safe. You are just one thought away. One thought away from getting caught again. One thought away from the wheel starting up. And so there is no point in expecting perfection, no point in holding yourself to a standard that even the most seasoned practitioner could not meet. The catching is universal. What matters is what happens next. So tonight, if you notice at any point that you have drifted, that the mind has wandered off into planning, or remembering, or worrying, treat the noticing itself as a homecoming. You were somewhere else. Now you are here. The door was open the whole time. The welcome was already in place. There is no need to add anything to this. No need to do it right. Let the return be simple, and let it be kind, and let that be the whole of it. Take a breath here. We will continue when you are ready. The Buddha once traced exactly how a single moment of seeing or hearing can mushroom, in the space of a few breaths, into a full-blown storm of worry. He laid it out step by step in a teaching called the Honeyball Sutta. Something touches the senses, a feeling arises, the mind recognizes it, begins thinking about it, and then, in his words, what one thinks about, that one mentally proliferates. That last step is where the trouble lives. The mind does not stop at one thought. it mushrooms. And tonight we look closely at how that happens, because seeing the chain clearly is one of the simplest ways to step out of it. Long ago, in an old kingdom known for its academies, a boy was admitted by examination to a famous school of scribes. He had prepared carefully. He had studied for months. His family had saved and sacrificed to give him this chance, and when the letter of admission arrived, the whole household celebrated. The first weeks at the academy were a rush of new faces, new routines, new expectations. The boy was bright and worked hard, and things went well enough, until one morning without warning, the master set a surprise examination. 10 characters to be written from memory, each in its proper form, each with its correct stroke order. The students bent over their papers. When the results came back, the boy had answered 3 correctly. 3 of 10. He stared at the paper. The number sat there like a bruise. He had never failed at anything before this. In his old village school, he had been the best in his class. 85 out of 100 was cause for disappointment. And now, 3 of 10. He hid the paper in the bottom of his writing case and said nothing to anyone. That evening, lying on his mat in the long dormitory, the mind began its work. 3 of 10. The master would report the result. The academy would review his admission. They would see that he did not belong here, that the examination board had made a mistake, that he was not suited for this level of study. He would be sent home. His parents would learn what had happened. The neighbors would know. The family that had saved for years to send him here would have spent everything on a failure. The boy lay in the dark, eyes open, and the mind kept building. From expulsion, the story moved to the long walk home, the silence of his father, the tight mouth of his mother, the averted eyes of the village. From the village, the story moved further, years into the future, a life without the academy's mark, doors closed, opportunities lost, a slow fading into someone ordinary and forgotten, wandering from town to town looking for work that would never come. None of this was happening. The boy was lying on a mat in a warm dormitory. The paper, with the 3 marks, was in his writing case. The master had not spoken to him. No one had been expelled. The only thing that had actually occurred was a surprise test on which he had done poorly. But in the dark, in the hours when the senses have nothing fresh to offer, and the mind feeds entirely on its own output, the proliferation ran unchecked. One fact, 3 marks of 10, had been multiplied into an entire imagined biography. Dawn came. The boy went to class. The master moved on to the next lesson. Over the following weeks and months, the boy settled in, studied hard, and did well enough. He finished his years at the academy with a perfectly ordinary record. The catastrophe written in those sleepless hours never arrived. Not one scene of it. The whole elaborate future had been a fiction, every frame of it, built from nothing more than a number on a piece of paper and a mind left alone with itself in the dark. The Buddha mapped this process with great care. In the Honeyball Sutta, he broke it into links, like a chain. Something touches the senses, a sound, a sight, a few words on a page. That is contact. It is the simplest thing in the world, just a meeting between a sense and an object. The next link is feeling. Before any thought forms, the experience picks up a tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. A bird song is pleasant. A harsh sound is unpleasant. The hum of a room is neutral. This happens instantly, before opinion, before story. It is the body's first reading of the moment. Then comes recognition. The mind files the experience. That is a test result. That is a stone on a shelf. That is a sound from downstairs. It compares. It categorizes. It labels. This is the mind's vast sorting system working at enormous speed. And then thinking begins. The mind starts to have opinions. It likes or dislikes. It judges. It plans. And here, at this link, the trouble usually starts. Because thinking, when it lands on anything with an emotional charge, does not stop at one thought. It mushrooms. One thought about the test leads to the master's opinion, which leads to expulsion, which leads to the walk home, which leads to the father's silence, which leads to a ruined life. All of it from 3 marks on a page. This mushrooming is what the Buddhist tradition calls papancha, mental proliferation. The mind rarely has just one thought about anything that matters to it. One impression becomes a flood, and the flood sweeps through past and future with equal ease. Within moments, a person can be living inside a memory from 20 years ago or a catastrophe that has not happened yet, all triggered by a single contact with the present moment. The chain has links, and because it has links, the mushrooming can be caught, not stopped, not fought, just seen at any point along the way for what it is, one thought breeding the next, with nothing underneath it but that first small contact. The night is where this process runs hardest. During the day, the senses are constantly receiving fresh input. New sounds, new sights, new interactions keep arriving, and each one gives the mind something real to work with. The chain still runs, but it is interrupted constantly by new contact, new information, new moments that pull attention back to what is actually happening. But at night, when the body is still and the room is dark and the world has gone to sleep, the senses go quiet. And into that quiet, the mind pours its own material. Without fresh contact to anchor it, thought becomes its own fuel. One worry feeds the next. One imagined scenario generates the emotional charge that powers the next scenario. The chain runs on its own momentum, looping back on itself, each pass adding new layers to a structure that has no foundation in anything real. This is why the same worry that felt manageable at noon can feel catastrophic at 3 a.m. The facts have not changed. The letter is still just a letter. The test is still just a test. The conversation is still just a conversation. But the mind, left alone in the dark, without anything to interrupt it, builds cathedrals of worry out of those same plain materials. And from inside the cathedral, the worry feels enormous, solid, permanent. It is only when morning comes and the senses open again, when the light returns and the sounds of the living world resume, that the cathedrals dissolve and the plain materials are visible once more. The boy at the academy knew this, though he did not have words for it. The night was where the 3 marks became an entire ruined life. The morning was where the ruined life became, once again, just a test. There is a folk tale, very old, that carries this same pattern with a different cast. On the eve of a young woman's wedding, in a farmhouse near a temple village, her mother sent her to the cellar to bring up jars of preserved fruit for the celebration the next day. The bride went down the stone steps with a candle, and as she reached for the jars on the lower shelf, she noticed something she had never paid attention to before. A heavy stone sat on a ledge above the row of wine jars, wedged against the wall, but not quite secure. She paused. She looked at the stone, and the mind began. What if the stone slipped? What if it fell onto the wine jars below? The jars would shatter. The wine would be lost. The feast tomorrow would have no wine. The guests would notice. Her husband's family would take offense. Words would be exchanged. The families would quarrel. The match would be called into question. The marriage itself might dissolve, and she would be left alone years from now, in this same cellar, in this same house, surrounded by the smell of spilled wine and the memory of a day that went wrong because of a stone on a shelf. She sat down on the cellar floor and began to weep. After some time, her mother came down looking for her. "What has happened?" she asked. The bride pointed to the stone and told her everything she had seen in her mind's eye. The shattered jars, the ruined feast, the offended family, the broken marriage, the lonely future. And the mother, hearing it all, sat down beside her daughter and wept too. Then the father came down. He heard the story. He looked at the stone, and he looked at the jars, and he saw the same terrible future his wife and daughter had described. He sat beside them and put his head in his hands. And there the three of them were, weeping in the cellar, mourning a future that existed nowhere but in the space between a stone and a shelf. A traveling nun, who had been offered lodging at the house for the night, heard the sound of crying and followed it down the stairs. She found the family, seated on the cellar floor, faces streaked, candle guttering, surrounded by untouched jars of wine. "What has happened?" she asked. They told her. The stone, the jars, the feast, the quarrel, the broken marriage, the lonely years. The nun looked at the stone. She looked at the jars. She looked at the three weeping faces. "And which of these things has happened?" she asked. Silence. "The stone is on the shelf," the nun said. "The jars are whole. The feast is tomorrow. Your families are asleep upstairs." She walked to the shelf, and together the four of them lifted the stone down to the floor. It was heavy, but it moved. It had always been movable. The bride wiped her eyes. Her mother stood up. Her father brushed the dust from his knees. The jars sat in their row, untouched, full. The wedding happened the next day. It was a good celebration. The wine was fine. The boy at the academy and the bride in the cellar share the same affliction and the same innocence. Neither of them was being foolish. The mind was doing what the mind does. It was following the chain the Buddha described, from one honest observation, a poor score, a loose stone, through feeling, through recognition, through thinking, and then out into the open country of proliferation, where one thought breeds the next and the next and the next, until the landscape is unrecognizable. But the cellar story reveals something the academy story does not. Proliferation can spread. The bride wept alone, and that was papancha doing its work inside one mind. Then her mother came down, heard the imagined future, and wept too. The father followed. Three people, sitting in a cellar, mourning a catastrophe that had not happened and would not happen, each one catching the proliferation from the person before, the way a fire catches from one branch to the next. The stone had not moved. The jars had not broken. Nothing at all had changed in the cellar except the minds of the people in it. This is how worry works in families, in friendships, in communities. One person's imagined future becomes another person's anxiety. The story is told, and the listener does not examine its foundation. The listener simply adds it to their own inventory of fears, and the construction grows, and soon everyone is weeping over wine jars that are sitting, whole and full, in a row on the shelf. The traveling nun's question cuts through all of it. And which of these things has happened? She does not say the fears are foolish. She does not scold the family for worrying. She simply asks them to check the story against the facts. And the facts, consulted directly, dissolve the story instantly. The stone is on the shelf. The jars are whole. The feast is tomorrow. That is all that is real, and it turns out to be enough. The chain is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. This is how consciousness works. Every human mind does this, in some form, with some material, at some hour. The question is never whether proliferation will happen. It will. The question is where in the chain it can be seen. And here is the encouraging part of the Buddha's teaching. The chain has links. It moves through stages, each one following the one before, and at any of those stages, the whole process can be seen. Just seen. And the seeing changes everything, because the moment you recognize the mushrooming for what it is, you are no longer inside the cathedral. You are standing outside it, looking at a structure built from thought, and from outside it looks exactly like what it is, an impressive construction with no foundation. As the evening settles deeper, there may be a familiar thread of worry running somewhere in the background. Something from the day, something about tomorrow, something that keeps offering itself for examination. If it is there, see if you can trace it backward, even just one or two links. Not to analyze it, not to solve it, just to notice where the mushrooming began. What was the stone on the shelf? What was the 3 marks of 10? Somewhere underneath the elaboration there is usually one small, plain fact, one moment of contact that the mind picked up and ran with. Finding that fact, even dimly, can be a relief. It restores proportion. It lets the cathedral settle back into what it was before the building started. One stone, one shelf, one moment. The facts themselves are often manageable. It is only when they are dressed in the mind's projections, layered with imagined futures and borrowed fears, that they become overwhelming. Stripped back to the single contact, they are just what they are. A sound, a score, a word, and the whole night is still ahead, open and unpopulated by catastrophe. There is no need to do anything with what you find. Tracing backward is not problem solving. It is just a way of letting the mind see its own work, the way the traveling nun let the family see the cellar as it actually was. Stone on the shelf, jars in a row, feast tomorrow, everyone safe. Stay with that for as long as it feels easy, and we will continue from here when you are ready. The Buddha, in one of his most practical observations, pointed out that the mind cannot hold two things at exactly the same moment. It cannot be fully inside a story and fully aware that a story is running at the same time. The moment awareness arrives, the spell breaks. The story may resume a second later, but for that one instant, there is a gap. This is where naming comes in. We have seen, across the earlier parts of our journey, how the mind builds its storms. The empty millstone, the mushrooming chain, the boy in the dark, the bride in the cellar. We have seen that seeing the spin is the beginning of freedom. But how does a person remember to see? In the middle of a thought storm that feels urgent and real, what creates the gap? Sometimes the answer is simpler than anyone expects. In a weaving village in a country of hills and slow rivers, there lived an elderly woman known throughout her district for two things: the quality of her cloth and the depth of her complaints. She was not an unkind woman. She was generous with her neighbors, patient with her grandchildren, and meticulous in her work at the loom. But she had been looking at the world through a particular lens for so long that the lens had become invisible to her. Everything she saw the flaw in first. The soup was too thin. The morning was too cold. The thread was not holding its dye. The roof needed mending. The rain came at the wrong time, or did not come at all. Her grown son, who had left the village years earlier to study at a monastery, visited her each season. He loved her deeply and found her complaints both familiar and heartbreaking, because underneath every one of them was a woman whose life was, by any honest measure, full. One autumn, sitting with her in the small house by the river, he had been reading about the power of gratitude. Study after study, tradition after tradition, converging on the same finding, that the simple practice of attending to what is good changes not only the mood, but the mind itself, over time. "That is remarkable," his mother said, when he shared what he had been reading. "Would you like to try a gratitude practice?" he asked. She looked at him with a half smile. "My son, I know my life is blessed, but I have been seeing the flaws in the cloth for a very long time. The eye goes where it has always gone. I do not think that will change now. If it could change," he said, "would you want it to?" She paused. Something honest moved behind her eyes. "Yes," she said. "If it could, I would. But do not hold your breath." "Then let us play a game," her son said. "Whenever you say something that carries a complaint, finish the sentence with one more phrase, 'And my life is very blessed.' That is all. You do not have to mean it. You do not have to believe it. Just say it." She looked skeptical, but something in the lightness of his asking made it possible to agree. A game. Not a practice, not a discipline, not a correction. A game between a mother and her son, with no stakes and no judgment. The next morning, standing at the loom, she said, "This thread has lost half its color since yesterday." Her son, sitting nearby with a cup of tea, waited. She caught his eye and sighed. "And my life is very blessed." An hour later, the neighbor's rooster has no sense of time. A pause. A faint smile. "And my life is very blessed." By midday, the pattern had a rhythm to it. The complaint would arrive, as complaints had arrived for decades, unbidden and automatic. And then, in the small space after it, the phrase would follow. Sometimes her son reminded her. Sometimes she caught it herself. Sometimes the phrase came out grudgingly, and sometimes with a kind of surprised amusement, as though she were hearing herself for the first time. Over the weeks of his visit, the game continued. One complaint after another met its completion. "The market has nothing fresh today, and my life is very blessed. My knees ache going up the hill, and my life is very blessed. That cloth will never sell at that price, and my life is very blessed." And then something began to feel different. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of revelation, no flash of insight. It was more like a slow turn of the loom, one thread crossing another, until the pattern of the cloth was different without any single thread being the cause. The phrase, repeated so many times, spoken lightly and without pressure, began to settle into the woman like rain into dry earth. She started saying it before the complaint was fully formed. She started saying it when there was no complaint at all, just as a description of the morning. The light on the river is nice today, and my life is very blessed. By the time her son left, at the end of autumn, the phrase had taken root. And in the years that followed, through his visits and through the quiet seasons between them, it grew. The woman who had spent a lifetime cataloguing flaws became, gradually and genuinely, a woman whose central theme was how blessed she was. Not because anything about her circumstances had changed. The roof still needed mending. The thread still lost its dye. But the lens had turned, and through the new lens, everything looked different. To the end of her days, the phrase held. It had started as a game. It became the truest thing she knew. There is a reason this worked where decades of well-meaning advice had failed. The phrase, "and my life is very blessed," did not argue with the complaint. It did not try to talk the mother out of her perception or prove her wrong. It simply added something to the sentence. It completed it rather than contradicting it. And because it was a game, because it was offered with lightness and a half smile, there was no resistance to overcome. The phrase slipped in through a door that discipline and correction would have found locked. This is the power of naming, and it is different from any kind of force. When a thought is met with argument, the argument becomes part of the thought. The mind engages with the counterpoint, weighs it, rejects it, and returns to the original position stronger than before. Fighting a thought feeds it. But when a thought is met with a name, something simpler happens. The name does not engage with the content. It does not debate whether the complaint is valid or whether the worry is justified. It simply identifies what is happening. There it is. That is the spin. And in that identification, the thinker steps slightly outside the thought. The gap opens. The story pauses. Naming is not suppression. It does not push the thought away or pretend it is not there. The complaint about the thread's lost color is acknowledged. The worry about the roof is heard. Nothing is denied. But the label adds a context that the thought itself does not carry. It adds the awareness that a thought is happening, and that awareness, however brief, is a different place to stand than inside the thought. What makes the difference is the tone. A grim label, spoken with severity, becomes new ammunition. There you go again. Catastrophizing is not a name. It is a judgment, and the mind receives it the way it receives all judgments, as something to argue with, resist, or collapse under. But, "and my life is very blessed," spoken lightly, almost playfully, is an invitation. It does not punish the complaint. It companions it. And the mind, offered a companion instead of a critic, tends to relax. This is why warmth matters so much in transformation. Decades of scolding, whether from others or from the inner voice, had done nothing to change the weaving mother's habit. The habit was too old, too practiced, too deeply grooved into her way of seeing. Force of will pushed against it and the habit pushed back. Discipline attacked it and the habit went underground, only to resurface the moment discipline loosened. But the game, offered with love and a half smile, went around the habit's defenses entirely. It did not ask the habit to die. It simply grew something alongside it, something warm and small and persistent, and over time the new growth was stronger than the old pattern. Not because it fought harder, because it was kinder. In a village, at the foot of a wooded mountain, long ago, there lived a grandmother who kept house for her grown granddaughter. The granddaughter was healthy and strong, and good at her work in the fields, but she could not sleep. Night after night, she lay awake on her mat, eyes open in the dark, while the mind ran through its inventory of troubles. The harvest, the weather, the leak in the storage shed, the cousin who had not visited, the road that needed clearing before the rains. Each worry arrived on the heels of the last, and by the time one had been examined and set down, 3 more had taken its place. Her grandmother watched this for many nights, listening to the restless turning on the other side of the room, the sighs, the shifting of the blankets. Finally, one evening after supper, the old woman brought out a small cloth bag and emptied its contents onto the table. Inside were 6 tiny figures, each no taller than a finger, made from bits of thread and scrap cloth wound around thin twigs. They were rough and simple, with little stitched faces and bodies dressed in colored thread. "What are these?" the granddaughter asked. "They are for your worries," the grandmother said. "Before you lie down tonight, take one figure in your hand and whisper one worry to it. Just one. Then set it beneath your pillow and take the next. And then the figure holds the worry, and you do not have to." The granddaughter smiled, the way a grown person smiles at a grandmother's old-fashioned remedy. But she was tired, and she was willing to try anything, so that night she sat on the edge of her mat and picked up the first small figure. "The thatch on the shed is coming loose," she whispered, holding it close to her ear, as though telling a secret. She tucked it under the pillow and picked up the next. "The rain may come before the rice is cut." Under the pillow. "I said something to my cousin last month that I wish I could take back." Under the pillow. One by one, she handed her worries to the little figures, each one spoken in a whisper, each one placed beneath the pillow as if being given to someone for safekeeping. By the time she reached the last figure, she noticed that her breathing had slowed. The worries were still real. The shed still needed fixing. The rain was still coming, but they were no longer circling inside her. They were somewhere else, held by small cloth hands, resting beneath her head. She slept that night more deeply than she had in weeks. Over the following nights, the practice continued. Some evenings the worries were many and the figures barely enough. Other evenings only 2 or 3 needed whispering. And gradually, over weeks, the granddaughter noticed something she had not expected. The whispering itself was changing. Not just its length, which grew shorter, but its quality. In the act of putting a worry into words small enough to give to a finger-sized figure, the worry shrank. What had felt enormous in the dark became, in the saying of it, manageable. The shed's thatch, the cousin's visit, the rain, each one, spoken aloud and set down, turned out to be exactly one thing. Not the cascade of everything. Just one thing, one stone on one shelf, held by one small figure made of thread. Years later, the granddaughter, grown old herself, sat at a table with her own grandchild, a restless girl who could not sleep for all the thoughts running circles behind her eyes. She emptied a cloth bag onto the table, and inside were 6 tiny figures, rough and simple, with stitched faces and bodies dressed in colored thread. "What are these?" the girl asked. "They are for your worries," the grandmother said. The game of the weaving mother and the whispering of the worry figures arrive at the same place from different angles. Both work because they take what is formless and private and spinning and give it a small, concrete, external shape. The mother's complaints were given a completion. The granddaughter's worries were given a holder. In both cases, the thought that had been looping endlessly inside the mind was moved very gently to the outside, where it could be seen for what it was: one thought, one complaint, one worry. Real, perhaps, but singular. Bounded, not the whole sky. Language is a lever on experience. A repeated phrase, spoken lightly and without belief at first, can slowly become true. The weaving mother did not believe her life was blessed on the first morning. She believed it by the last winter of her life. The granddaughter did not believe a cloth figure could hold a worry. But in the act of whispering, the worry loosened its grip, and what the mind believes matters less, in the end, than what the hands and the voice keep doing. The Buddhist tradition has a term for this kind of practice. It is called sampajana, clear comprehension, the capacity to know what is happening while it is happening. It is the sister of mindfulness, and where mindfulness remembers to attend, clear comprehension knows what it is attending to. Together they form the awareness that can hold a thought without being held by it. And naming, in its simplest form, is an act of clear comprehension. It says, "This is what is happening right now. Not this is the truth. Not this is the disaster. Just, this is what is happening." The grandmother's figures work the same way, though they use the hands instead of the voice. In the act of picking up a small cloth figure and whispering a worry to it, the worrier has already done the essential thing. She has separated herself from the worry just enough to say it. She has made the worry into something she is holding, rather than something she is drowning in. And in that small separation, the whole landscape changes. The worry is still real. The shed still needs fixing. But the worry is over there, in the hands of a small figure, and the worrier is over here, lying on a mat, breathing, alive, and for the moment, not spinning. So tonight, very lightly and with no obligation at all, consider whether there is a word or a phrase that fits your own familiar spin. Not a correction, not an instruction, something affectionate, something small, something you could say to yourself the way a grandmother says a familiar thing to a child who has heard it 100 times. It does not need to be clever. It does not need to be spiritual. It can be as simple as, "There it is again," spoken with a kind of tired fondness. And if nothing comes, that is fine. The figures are under the pillow. The loom is still. The night holds everything, and nothing needs to be decided or solved or named until it is ready. Let the breath carry you for a while, and we will meet again when you are ready. The Buddha observed that all constructed things are impermanent. Feelings arise and pass. Thoughts form and dissolve. Moods come and go like weather. This is one of the most fundamental observations in the entire tradition, and most people who have spent even a little time in meditation have experienced its truth firsthand. Thoughts pass. Emotions pass. States of mind pass. And yet there is one category of thought that seems to resist this truth entirely. It does not feel like weather. It does not feel like a passing cloud. It feels like bedrock. It feels like the ground itself. These are the thoughts that begin with the words "I am." So far tonight we have explored how the mind builds its storms around events. A letter, a test, a stone on a shelf. The chain of proliferation takes a single contact and multiplies it into a vast imagined future. But events are, in a certain sense, easy to see through. Once the morning comes and the shed is standing, and the wedding goes well, and the academy does not expel anyone, the mind's construction is revealed as construction. The evidence dissolves it. Identity thoughts are harder. They do not dissolve on contact with morning light, because they are not about what might happen tomorrow. They are about what you are. And the mind treats them with a special seriousness, a gravity that it does not extend to ordinary worries. The rain might ruin the harvest is a worry, and a person can recognize it as one. I am not the kind of person who succeeds is something else entirely. It arrives with the weight of settled truth, and it lodges in a place where evidence has difficulty reaching. This is because the mind, when it constructs a verdict about the self, does not present it as a construction. It presents it as a discovery. I am not enough does not sound like a thought. It sounds like a fact that has finally been admitted. And the longer it sits, the more real it feels, until a person can carry a sentence about who they are for decades without ever examining where the sentence came from or whether it was true in the first place. In a forest monastery, deep in a season of silent retreat, a young nun had been practicing loving-kindness meditation for many days. The practice was simple: sit, bring someone to mind, and offer them warmth, goodwill, kindness, the feeling of wishing them well. For the first days, the practice went smoothly enough. She could summon warmth for her teacher, for her friends in the community, for the children she sometimes saw in the village below the monastery. The feeling was not always strong, but it was there, and she could feel it moving in her chest, a kind of opening, a kind of softness. Then one afternoon, something changed. She sat down as usual, brought a face to mind, and offered the phrases. And nothing happened. No warmth. No softness. No opening. The phrases came out of her mouth like dry leaves falling, and behind them there was nothing at all. She tried harder. She concentrated. She changed the face, tried another person, tried herself. Nothing. The chest felt like a stone. She sat with this for the rest of the afternoon, growing more and more unsettled. By evening she could no longer keep it inside, and she went to the small hut where the elder teacher lived, an old woman who had been practicing and teaching for many decades. Something has happened, the young nun said, sitting on the floor of the hut, her hands in her lap. My heart has become stone. The elder looked at her. There is no warmth in me at all, the young nun continued. I have been sitting for hours and nothing comes. I offer the phrases and they fall into nothing. The elder nodded. She had heard words like these before. I think I know why, the young nun said. Her voice dropped. I cannot love. I have never been able to love, not truly. And I think that is because I was never loved. And I was never loved because... She paused, and when she continued, her voice was barely audible. Because I am not lovable. The room was very still. A candle flickered. Outside, the last birds were settling into the trees. The elder let the silence hold for a long moment. Then she said softly, "You have told me 4 things just now. How many of them did you actually observe?" The young nun looked up. "You said your heart felt like stone. You said you cannot love. You said you were never loved. And you said you are not lovable." 4 statements. How many did you observe this afternoon in your sitting? The young nun opened her mouth, then closed it. She thought. She went back through the afternoon, back through the sitting, back to the moment when the phrases fell into silence. 1. She said, "I observed one thing. Warmth did not arise." "Yes," the elder said. "That is what happened. Warmth did not arise this afternoon. Everything else you built." The young nun stared at her. "Warmth did not arise," the elder repeated. "That is a fact. It is a simple observation about one afternoon of practice. From that single observation, you constructed a chain. I cannot love. I was never loved. I am not lovable. 4 links. Each one felt like it followed from the one before. Each one felt true. But the only one you actually experienced was the first, and even the first was only an observation about one sitting on one afternoon. The young nun sat very still. Something was shifting, the way the ground shifts when a stone that seemed permanent is lifted, and the earth beneath it is soft and ordinary. "The mind does this," the elder said. "It takes one moment and builds a verdict. And the verdict feels more real than the moment, because the moment was small and the verdict is vast. But the moment was the truth, and the verdict was a story. And the story has an author." This is the deepest form of the proliferation we have been tracing all evening. When Papancha turns its attention from events to identity, it does not build a cathedral of worry about the future. It builds something far more convincing, a verdict about the self. And the verdict, once installed, shapes everything that follows. It filters what is seen. It interprets what is experienced. It decides in advance what is possible and what is not. A person living inside the verdict, "I am not lovable," will find evidence for that verdict everywhere, because the verdict itself determines what counts as evidence. The chain the young nun built was tight and logical. If warmth did not arise, then the capacity for love must be absent. If the capacity is absent, it was probably never developed. If it was never developed, it was probably never received. And if it was never received, there must be a reason. The logic is seamless. Each step follows from the one before, and yet the entire structure rests on a single neutral fact. Warmth did not arise during one afternoon of practice. That is all. Everything above that single fact is story. The elder teacher's intervention was precise. She did not argue with the verdict. She did not say, "Of course you are lovable," or "Don't be silly, you are a wonderful person." She did not offer comfort or reassurance, because comfort and reassurance are aimed at the verdict, and the verdict is not the problem. The problem is the chain, and the only way to address the chain is to trace it back to its first link and show that the whole construction hangs from a single, small, entirely ordinary observation. This is what it means to walk the chain backward. You start with the final verdict, the heaviest sentence, the one that sounds like bedrock. And you ask, where did this come from? and it came from the link before it, and that link came from the one before that, and so on, step by step, until you arrive at the original observation, which is almost always startlingly small. A feeling that did not arise, a test that went poorly, a word that was spoken in a certain tone, something so ordinary that, seen on its own, it could never bear the weight of the verdict that was built on top of it. The relief of finding the original observation is enormous. Not because the observation changes, but because the verdict is revealed as optional. It was built. It has an author. And what was built can be seen as built, and in the seeing, it loosens. It does not have to be torn down. It does not have to be fought. It just has to be seen for what it is, a construction, assembled from a single fact, by a mind doing what minds do. And here is something that may offer a strange kind of comfort. This pattern is nearly universal. The elder teacher in the forest monastery had heard variations of the young nun's confession many, many times before. Different faces, different stories, different starting points, but the same chain, built the same way, arriving at the same kind of verdict. I am not enough. I am broken. Something is fundamentally wrong with me. Each person who carried such a sentence believed it was uniquely theirs, a private truth too shameful to share, discovered alone and confirmed by a lifetime of evidence. And each of them was astonished to learn that the teacher had heard it before, from someone else, built from a different starting point, but following the same links to the same conclusion. The pattern is not personal. The mind that builds verdicts about the self is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what minds do. It takes a moment of experience, applies feeling and perception, begins thinking, and proliferates. The only difference is that when the subject is the self, the proliferation lands harder, because I am sentences carry a weight that the harvest might fail. Sentences do not. They feel like discoveries about nature. They feel like the flaw. And so they are harder to see as built, harder to trace back to their small beginnings, harder to hold as weather rather than ground. There is a story from the Pali Canon that carries this teaching in a different and striking way. In the city of Savatthi, there lived a man named Sunita. He was a sweeper, born into a family whose only work was clearing rubbish from the roads. His wages were barely enough to feed himself. He had no house to sleep in and no community to belong to. When a person of higher standing walked down the road, Sunita had to step aside, lower his eyes, and press himself against the wall, so that not even his shadow would fall across their path. If he was not quick enough, he was scorned. This was not a story Sunita told about himself. It was a story told about him by everyone from the day he was born. The verdict was installed before he could walk. You are this and only this. You are a sweeper. You are untouchable. You are not fit to be seen. One morning, Sunita was sweeping a long, dusty road in the early light. His body was bent to the work, his eyes on the ground, as they always were. He heard the sound of many footsteps approaching, the rustle of many robes, and he looked up to see the Buddha walking toward him, followed by hundreds of monks. Sunita's heart surged with a feeling he could not name. Joy and fear together, tangled and sharp. There was no alley to hide in, no doorway to slip through. The road was open and the procession was coming straight toward him. He set down his broom, pressed his back against a low wall, and joined his palms in front of his chest. It was all he could do. The Buddha stopped. He stood in front of this man who had spent his whole life stepping aside, and he looked at him, and what Sunita saw in that look was something no one had ever offered him before. He was seen, not the sweeper, not the untouchable, not the category or the caste or the verdict. Just him, the person standing against the wall with dust on his hands and his palms pressed together. "My friend," the Buddha said, in a voice that carried no trace of pity or condescension, "would you like to leave this work and follow me?" No one had ever called Sunita friend. No one had ever offered him a choice. He opened his mouth and found that he could barely speak. "If even someone like you would accept someone like me," he said, "how could I refuse?" The Buddha ordained him on the spot, in the road, in front of the whole procession. And from that day forward, Sunita walked among the monks, received teachings, practiced meditation, and in time attained the deepest realization the tradition recognizes. Kings bowed to him. Teachers sought his counsel, and no one ever again could say what he had been, because what he had been was a sentence written by other people, and the sentence had been erased. The Buddha, speaking of Sunita afterward, offered a single image. As on a rubbish heap by the roadside, a lily may grow, fragrant and sweet, so among the rubbish of the world, by insight, shines the Buddha's child. The verdict placed on Sunita was external, assigned by a society that sorted people before they could speak. The verdict the young nun placed on herself was internal, assembled from a single empty afternoon by a mind that was trying to explain its own experience. But the mechanism is the same. A conclusion about identity is formed, and then the conclusion becomes the lens through which everything is seen. The sweeper sees himself as untouchable because that is what he has been told. The nun sees herself as unlovable because that is what one sitting seemed to prove. And in both cases, the verdict feels permanent. It feels like nature, but it is not nature. It is a sentence. And sentences, however long they have been believed, are made of words, and words are made of thought, and thought is precisely the thing the Buddha spent his life showing to be constructed, impermanent, and empty of the solidity it claims for itself. Every I am sentence is an invitation to look more closely, not to reject it, not to replace it with a more flattering version, just to ask, when was this written? What was the original observation? And is the verdict truly the only thing that could have been built from that single small beginning? Tonight, there may be an old sentence living somewhere in the background. Something about what kind of person you are. Something about what you are capable of, or what you deserve, or what you lack. These sentences are so familiar that they barely register as thoughts anymore. They feel like the floor. If one of them surfaces, try adding 4 small words in front of it silently. A thought is saying that. Not, this is true. Not, this is false. Just, a thought is saying that I am not enough. A thought is saying that I should be further along. A thought is saying that something is wrong with me. The 4 words do not change the sentence. They change the relationship to it. They move it from bedrock to weather. And weather, however heavy, however familiar, passes. Let that settle. There is no hurry and nothing at all that needs to be resolved. We will go on whenever you are ready. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a figure called Mara. Mara is the voice of doubt, the voice of temptation, the voice that whispers, "You are not good enough," or "This will never work," or "Who do you think you are?" In the old stories, Mara is sometimes described as a being who visits the Buddha, but the tradition is clear about what Mara actually represents. The familiar thoughts that return again and again, the ones that have been visiting for so long they feel like permanent residents. What makes the Mara stories remarkable is not that the Buddha defeated this voice. It is that the voice kept coming back. Even after the deepest awakening in the history of the tradition, Mara still showed up. And each time, the Buddha's response was the same. He did not argue. He did not fight. He did not try to make the voice go away. He simply said, "I see you, Mara." And Mara left. Every time. Not because he was driven out, but because he was seen. There is a story from the Pali commentaries, preserved in the Dhammapada traditions, about an elder monk named Kundadana. From the day he entered the monastic life, a strange thing began to happen. A phantom form appeared behind him wherever he went. He could not see it himself. He was never aware of it. But everyone else could. When he walked through the monastery grounds, the other monks saw a figure following him. When he stood in the teaching hall, the figure stood behind him. When he sat in meditation, it sat at his back. The other monks began to murmur. They brought their concerns to the senior members of the community. "There is something following this monk," they said. "We do not know what it is, but it appears wherever he goes. Perhaps he should leave." The murmuring grew. Kundadana heard the whispers but could not understand them, because he himself saw nothing. He continued his practice. He continued his walking, his sitting, his study. The phantom continued to follow. Word reached the king of the region, who was curious and concerned. He came to the monastery to see for himself. He asked the elder to step outside, and when Kundadana stood below the main hall, the king, looking down from the upper floor, saw the phantom form appear behind him, just as the monks had described. The king descended and approached the elder. "Where is the figure that was standing behind you just now?" he asked. "I do not see any figure, great king," Kundadana said. "I have never seen it. That is what everyone tells me, but it is not something I have ever witnessed." The king went back upstairs and looked again. The phantom was there, behind the elder's back. He came down again. "It is there," he said. "I see it plainly." "Great king," the elder said, with no distress in his voice, "I believe you. Many people have told me the same thing. But I have looked, and there is nothing there. I do not know what others see, but when I look for it, I find nothing at all." The king stood still for a long time. Then he understood. What followed the elder was not a being. It was a phantom, an appearance, something that existed in the seeing of others, but had no substance when examined directly. It could not be found. It could not be grasped. It could not be questioned or confronted, because there was nothing there to confront. And the elder, who had never once tried to fight or flee from this phantom, who had simply continued his practice while the murmuring swirled around him, remained at peace throughout. The appearance followed him for a time, and then, as appearances do, it wore itself out. It faded. It ceased. And the elder's peace, which had never depended on the phantom's presence or absence, continued undisturbed. This story carries a teaching that touches very close to ordinary life, because most of us have our own phantoms. They are not visible to others in quite the way Kundadana's was, but they are just as persistent and just as convincing. The recurring thought that says, "You are falling behind." The voice that revisits an old failure every time something new is attempted. The familiar feeling of being watched and found wanting, which arrives uninvited and lingers long after the facts have moved on. These phantoms follow us the way Kundadana's followed him. Everywhere, without exception, visible to the part of the mind that believes in them, invisible to the part that looks directly at them and finds nothing solid there. And the murmuring that surrounded the elder is familiar too. When a recurring thought has followed someone for long enough, the mind begins to treat it as established fact. The community of inner voices agrees, this thought is real, this doubt is legitimate, this fear is justified. The murmuring reinforces the phantom. Each repetition makes it seem more solid, more permanent, more like a real thing rather than an appearance. And the person inside the murmuring can start to believe that the phantom defines them, that it is part of their identity rather than a visitor passing through. But the elder never engaged with the murmuring. He did not defend himself. He did not try to prove the phantom was not there. He did not argue with the monks who saw it. He simply said, "I have looked and I find nothing." And he continued his practice, steady and undisturbed, while the appearance that others took for reality wore itself out on its own. This is the radical teaching at the center of the Mara stories. Freedom does not come from making the visitors stop. It comes from changing the relationship to their arrival. The natural response, when a thought keeps coming back, is to fight it, to argue with it, to push it away or try to prove it wrong. And sometimes this works for a moment, the way swinging at a shadow works for a moment. The arm passes through empty air and the shadow reappears in the same place. Fighting a thought gives it something to push against, and in the pushing, it gains the very solidity it did not have before. The Buddha's response to Mara offers a different path entirely. "I see you, Mara." Not, "Go away." Not, "You are wrong." Not, "I will prove that I am worthy." Just, "I see you." The thought is acknowledged. Its presence is noted. And then, without resistance and without engagement, it is allowed to be exactly what it is, a visitor with no substance. This is not the same as ignoring the thought. Ignoring is a kind of turning away, a pretending that the visitor is not there. And the visitor, unacknowledged, does not leave. It knocks louder. It finds new ways in. It takes the ignoring as evidence that it is dangerous enough to be feared, and fear is precisely the fuel it runs on. Recognition is different from both fighting and ignoring. It stands in the doorway, looks directly at the visitor, and says, "I know what you are. You are a thought. You are a feeling. You are an old habit showing up again. You are familiar, and you are seen, and you do not need to be obeyed." Long ago, in a mountain village in the east, there lived a young wife whose husband had returned from a long time away. He had been sent to labor in a distant province, months of hard work far from home, and when he came back, he was changed. The warmth that had once filled their small house was gone. He sat by the fire and stared at nothing. He spoke only when spoken to, and then in short, flat sentences. Sometimes, in glimpses, the old warmth surfaced, a half smile at the cat, a hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he passed. But these moments were rare and vanished quickly. The wife tried everything she could think of. She cooked his favorite meals. She kept the house warm and clean. She sat with him in the evenings and tried to draw him out. Nothing changed. He remained distant, closed, unreachable. In desperation, she walked up the mountain to see an old herbalist who lived alone in a hut near the tree line. The herbalist was known throughout the district for her remedies. If anyone could help, she could. The wife sat on the ground outside the hut and told her story. The husband who had come home but not really come home. The silence. The distance. The glimpses of warmth that appeared and disappeared like sun through clouds. "Please," she said, "make me something that will bring him back." The herbalist listened carefully. Then she said, "There is a remedy, but it requires one ingredient that I do not have." "Anything," the wife said. "Whatever it takes. I need a single whisker from the chin of a living tiger." The wife stared at her. The mountain above the village was home to a tiger, and everyone in the valley knew it. The animal was wild, powerful, and completely unapproachable. A whisker from a living tiger was not a difficult task. It was an impossible one, but she had nothing left to try. That night, she cooked a bowl of rice and meat and carried it up the mountain in the dark. She set it on a flat stone near the ridge where the tiger was known to pass and retreated to a safe distance. The next morning, the bowl was empty. She did this again the following night, and the night after, and the night after that. Each time, she left the food and withdrew. Each time, by morning, it was gone. After a week, she began to stay a little closer. After 2 weeks, she could see the tiger's shape moving in the moonlight as it approached the stone. After a month, she could hear its breathing. The animal knew she was there. It had grown accustomed to her scent, her stillness, the regularity of her offerings. It did not approach her, but it no longer fled. Weeks became months. The wife climbed the mountain every night. She sat a little closer each time. The tiger ate. She waited. The distance between them shrank so gradually that neither of them could have said when the change happened. One night she was 20 paces away, then 15, then 10, then close enough to see the light in the tiger's eyes. One evening, after many months, the tiger finished eating and did not immediately leave. It stood near the stone looking at her. She could see its whiskers in the moonlight, long and silver against the dark fur. Very slowly, she extended her hand. The tiger held still. She reached forward and, with a single careful motion, plucked one whisker from beneath its chin. The tiger flinched but did not move. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. She held the whisker all the way down the mountain and presented it to the herbalist the next morning, trembling with exhaustion and triumph. The herbalist took the whisker, examined it in the light, and dropped it into the fire. The wife cried out, "What are you doing? Do you know what it took to get that?" "Yes," the herbalist said. "I know exactly what it took. You approached a wild, unreachable creature with patience and care, night after night, without force, without demand, giving what you could and asking for nothing. You earned its trust one bowl at a time. You did not try to tame it. You simply showed up." She paused. "Now tell me, is a husband who sits by the fire more dangerous than a tiger on a mountain?" The wife stood very still. "You already have the cure," the herbalist said. You have been practicing it for months. Go home and offer your husband the same patience you offered the tiger. One bowl at a time, one evening at a time, without force, without demand. The tiger's whisker and the phantom behind the elder arrive at the same place from very different roads. The phantom teaches that what follows us for years, the recurring thought, the persistent doubt, has no substance when looked at directly. The tiger teaches that what seems untouchable can be slowly befriended, not through force, but through steady, patient presence, offered without any demand for a particular result. Both are stories about the long-term relationship with what is difficult. The phantom does not disappear because the elder fights it. It disappears because he remains steady while it wears itself out. The tiger does not yield because the wife commands it. It yields because she was willing to show up, night after night, asking nothing and offering everything, until the wildness softened on its own. What neither story promises is a quick resolution. The phantom followed Kundadana for a long time. The wife climbed the mountain for months, and the husband at the hearth would not be reached in a single evening of patience, any more than the tiger was reached in a single bowl of food. The teaching here is not, try this, and your problems will vanish. The teaching is, the relationship is the practice. Showing up, recognizing, offering steady presence without demand. This is the work. And the work is not a means to an end. It is the end. In everyday life, the thoughts that visit most persistently are usually the oldest ones. The doubt that has been running since childhood. The criticism that sounds like a particular voice from years ago. The fear that surfaces every time something new is attempted. These are not going to be resolved in one sitting or one naming or one moment of recognition. They may visit for years. They may visit for a lifetime. But the visits can change. The thought that once overwhelmed can become something recognized. The voice that once commanded can become something noted and allowed to pass. And over time, with patience, the visits grow lighter, shorter, less consuming, not because the thought was conquered, but because the mind that receives it has grown more spacious. It has learned from Sengai and from the elder and from the woman on the mountain that the visitor is just a visitor and that the door does not have to be locked against it or open to obey it. It can simply be seen through. This is the teaching about Mara that carries into daily life. The recurring voices, the old doubts, the familiar patterns of self-criticism and fear do not go away because they are conquered. They quiet down because they are recognized. They lose their grip because they are met, not with resistance, but with the steady awareness that sees them clearly and does not flinch. I see you. That is all, and it is enough. If there is a thought running tonight, a familiar one that has been visiting for a long time, there is no need to push it away. See if it is possible, even for a moment, to turn toward it the way the elder turned toward his phantom, or the way the wife turned toward the mountain. Not to fix it, not to obey it, just to recognize it. I see you, silently, kindly, the way you would greet an old acquaintance who shows up uninvited but is no longer a stranger. Let that be the offering for now, and rest here as long as you like before we move on. The word Buddha is not a name. It is a description. It comes from the Sanskrit root bud, which means to wake up, to know, to understand. A Buddha is simply one who is awake. And this matters more than it might seem at first, because it means that what the entire tradition points toward is not a distant achievement reserved for extraordinary beings. It is a state that can be entered, left, entered again, and that is available to anyone who has a mind. Everything we have explored tonight, the spin and the seeing of the spin, the flip and the welcome home, the mushrooming and the naming, the verdicts and the patience, all of it circles this single word: awake. Not awake as a permanent condition, not awake as a badge of honor or a spiritual rank. Just awake, right now, in this breath, for however long it lasts. In the Pali Canon, in a teaching called the Dona Sutta, there is an account of a traveler who came upon something unusual on the road. He was a Brahmin, a learned and observant man, and as he walked, he noticed footprints in the dust that struck him as extraordinary. There was something about the marks, their depth, their spacing, some quality he could not name, that made him stop. He followed the footprints. They led off the road and into a grove of trees, and there, seated beneath one of the trees, was a figure of remarkable stillness. The man's whole bearing radiated something the Brahmin had never quite encountered before. It was not holiness, exactly, or power. It was more like a complete absence of anything extra. As if the man sitting under the tree had nothing left to prove, nothing to defend, nothing to add to the moment he was in. His robes were simple. His posture was settled. His eyes, when they opened, were clear and without urgency. The Brahmin had met many teachers. He had studied with scholars who could recite entire volumes from memory. He had debated with philosophers whose reasoning was sharp enough to cut stone. But he had never stood before anyone who gave off this particular quality, this sense of a person who was fully and completely where he was, with nothing running underneath, no performance, no agenda, no restlessness. The Brahmin stood before him and asked the first question that came to mind. "Are you a god?" "No," the figure said. "Are you a spirit? A heavenly being of some kind?" "No." The Brahmin paused. He was running through his categories, the filing system of a well-trained mind, and none of them fit. "Are you a man?" "No." The Brahmin was confused. He had exhausted every category he knew. "Then what are you?" "I am awake," the figure said. That was all. No title, no category, no description of rank or attainment or spiritual lineage. Just, "I am awake." And the word that the tradition built around this answer, Buddha, was never intended as a noun. It was a verb caught mid-stride, a description of something happening, not something achieved. Not, "I am a Buddha," the way a person might say, "I am a king," or "I am a teacher." Just, in this moment, here, now, awake. This exchange strips away everything that the mind tends to accumulate around spiritual life. The Brahmin asked his questions in categories: God, spirit, man. He was trying to file the figure he saw into a system he understood, the way the mind always tries to file experience into existing categories. And the Buddha declined every category. Not because the categories were wrong, but because what he was pointing to did not fit inside any of them. Awakeness is not a thing. It is not an identity. It cannot be filed. It is what is happening when the filing stops. When the mind pauses its sorting and comparing and labeling, what is left is awareness itself, bare and open and present. And that bare presence is what the word Buddha points at. The Brahmin wanted to know what the Buddha was, the way you might want to know what something is, so you can put it on a shelf and understand it. But the answer, I am awake, refuses the shelf entirely. It says, what you are looking at is not a what. It is a how. It is a quality of being present that does not belong to any category, because it is prior to all categories. It is the seeing that comes before the sorting begins. This is why the answer is so powerful and so disorienting. It does not give the mind anything to work with. There is nothing to compare, nothing to debate, nothing to file. There is only the invitation, this state that you sense in me, this quality that made you follow the footprints, is not mine. It belongs to awareness itself. And awareness is what you already are, underneath your own sorting and categorizing and filing. The awakeness is not over here, in the figure under the tree. It is everywhere, in every mind, waiting for the categories to pause. And here is what matters most for tonight. This same awareness is what has been operating at every turning point in our journey so far. When the woman striding through the winter night heard herself grumbling, what hurt her? When the old cook said, if not now, when? What was present in him that the young scholar was missing? When the elder, with the phantom behind him, said, I do not see it, I find nothing there, what was doing the looking? The same awareness, the same awakeness. It does not require a title, or a history, or a special experience. It is what is here when the commentary pauses. It is the other side of the coin that is always ready to be turned. And this is the great democratization at the heart of the Buddha's teaching. The word Buddha does not name a person who was different in kind from everyone else. It names a quality of attention that every human mind already possesses. Every moment of noticing in tonight's journey, every flip, every return, every recognition, has been a small instance of the same awakeness the Buddha was pointing to on that road. The woman striding through the winter night was, for one breath, awake. The old cook drying mushrooms was, hour by hour, awake. The father watching the road for his son was, year by year, awake. None of them would have claimed the title, but the quality was the same. This means that enlightenment, stripped of its mystique, is not something that happens once, to one person, after extraordinary effort. It is something that happens many times a day, to ordinary people, usually without being noticed. Every time the mind pauses between one thought and the next, there is a flash of awareness that is, for that instant, completely free. Every time a person looks up from their phone and sees the sky, really sees it, there is awakeness. Every time a parent watches a child sleeping, and the whole world simplifies into that one face, there is the Buddha's, I am awake, quiet and ordinary and complete. A Buddhist philosopher was once asked to describe the entire human experience in 3 words. He said, lost in thought. That is one side of the coin. The other side has no name at all, because naming it would just be more thought. But for the sake of speaking about it, the tradition uses this word, awake. The master Zhao Zhou, one of the great teachers of the Chan tradition, had a way of pointing to this awakeness that bypassed every kind of elaboration. He did not lecture. He did not explain. He simply met each person where they stood and offered the plainest possible response. A young monk arrived at Zhao Zhou's monastery after a long journey. He had traveled for weeks through the mountains, sleeping in open fields and roadside shelters, carrying little more than his bowl and his robe and his burning questions about the nature of awakening. He had heard stories about Zhao on the road, from other travelers, from innkeepers, from monks at the temples where he stopped. Everyone spoke of the old master's clarity, his directness, the way he could open a student's understanding with a single sentence. The young monk had rehearsed his questions. He had imagined the conversation he would have. He had pictured himself sitting before the master and receiving the teaching that would finally bring everything together. When he finally stood before the old master, he was full of anticipation. This was the teacher everyone spoke of. This was the moment he had been walking toward for months. "I have just entered the monastery," the monk said, bowing deeply. "Please, master, teach me." Zhao looked at him. His eyes were calm and unhurried. "Have you eaten your rice porridge?" he asked. The monk blinked. Of all the things the master might have said, this was not among the ones he had imagined. "Yes," he said, "I have eaten." "Then wash your bowl," Zhao said. The monk stood there. The morning hall was quiet around them. Steam rose from the kitchen. Other monks passed on their way to their tasks. Somewhere outside, a bird called and stopped, and the instruction hung in the air like a bell that had just been struck. "Wash your bowl. Not sit and I will explain the nature of mind. Not, here are the stages of realization. Not, let me tell you about emptiness. Just, you have eaten, so wash your bowl. The next plain thing. The thing that is right here, right now, waiting to be met." All of the monk's preparation, all of his rehearsed questions, all of his expectations about what enlightenment would look like when it arrived, had no place to land. The instruction was so plain, so ordinary, so free of anything to grasp or analyze, that the thinking mind had nothing to do with it. And in that empty space, where thinking stopped and the bowl remained, something opened. The tradition records that something shifted in the monk at that moment. Not because Zhao had given him a great teaching, but because the plainness of the instruction left no room for the mind to build anything on top of it. There was nothing to figure out, nothing to compare against his expectations, nothing to carry forward into the next question. Just a bowl and water and the act of washing. And in that act, done whole, the awakeness the monk had traveled months to find was already present. It had been present the whole time. It was present in the porridge, in the eating, in the bowl, in the water. It was present in the walking and the sleeping and the carrying of the robe through the mountains. It was present everywhere, and the only thing that had been missing was the recognition of it. This is the teaching that gathers everything we have explored tonight into one simple point. The awakeness the Buddha described on the road, the awareness that sees the wheel, flips the coin, welcomes the return, traces the chain, names the spin, loosens the verdict, recognizes the phantom. It is all the same awareness. And it does not live in a special place or a special state. It lives here, in this breath, in the weight of the body on the bed, in the sound of the room, in the feeling of the air on the skin. There are only two places to be, here or lost in thought. That is the binary. And the comfort of that binary is that here is always available. It is always one step away, one breath away, one small noticing away. However long the mind has been wandering, however deep into the story it has traveled, The return is always the same distance. One moment. One flip. One oh. There is no third state. There is no halfway house between awake and lost. This is what Anam Thubten meant when he said there are only two states of consciousness. And this simplicity, which might sound severe, is actually a great comfort, because it means there is never a long road back. No matter how far away the mind has traveled, no matter how elaborate the story it has been living inside, the return to here is always one step. Always. The distance never increases. The door never locks. The old cook drying mushrooms in the sun knew this. Sengai waiting in the cold knew this. The woman walking through the winter night discovered it by accident. The father watching the road for decades embodied it through patience. And Zhaozhou, asked for the deepest teaching in the tradition, pointed to a dirty bowl. Because the bowl is the teaching. The breath is the teaching. The sound of the room right now is the teaching. Whatever is here, met without commentary, without the mind's overlay, without the endless sorting and judging and projecting, is already awake, already complete, already enough. The cook knew this while drying mushrooms. The woman knew this while striding through the cold. The father knew this while watching the road. They did not call it enlightenment. They did not need to. The word was never the point. The waking was the point, and the waking happened inside the most ordinary moments of their ordinary lives. So tonight, there is nothing to achieve and nothing to understand. The whole of what has been offered across these hours comes down to this: you are here. The mind may be busy. It may be quiet. It may be spinning or it may be still. All of that is fine. Underneath whatever the mind is doing, the awareness that knows what the mind is doing is present. It has been present the whole time. It was present before the first word of this episode, and it will be present after the last. Zhao Zhou's instruction was the simplest possible form of this truth. The monk had eaten, so the next thing was to wash the bowl. Not to understand the bowl, not to contemplate the meaning of bowls, not to achieve bowl washing mastery, just to wash the bowl, whole and complete, with nothing left over and nothing added. The breath is like this. It does not need to be watched in a special way. It does not need to be controlled or deepened or made into a meditation. It is already happening, already complete, already a moment of the awareness the Buddha described on the road. The only thing that makes it feel ordinary is the mind's habit of wanting something more, something bigger, something that looks like the enlightenment it imagined. But the ordinary breath, fully met, is the whole of it. The extraordinary was always hiding inside the ordinary, waiting to be recognized. If there is a bowl to wash, wash the bowl. If there is a breath to feel, feel the breath. If there is nothing at all to do, then do nothing, and let the nothing be complete. Rest here, and we will continue together when you are ready. The great Buddhist scholar Nyanaponika Thera once described mindfulness as possessing a strength that most people overlook. He wrote, "Mindfulness possesses the strength, the capacity for deferring action and applying the brake, for stopping rash interference and for suspending judgment while pausing to observe facts and reflect upon them wisely." The brake. That is an unexpected word for a spiritual quality. We think of mindfulness as something soft, something open, something receptive, and it is all of those things. But it is also a brake. It is the capacity to stop, to pause before the cascade, to hold still for one breath while the mind reaches for its usual reaction, and to let that breath be enough. Senkan, the third patriarch of Chan Buddhism, put it even more directly. Stop talking and thinking, and there is nothing you will not be able to know. And from the Tao Te Ching, he who keeps still and knows where to stop will not meet danger. These teachings do not say that stopping is one step among many. They say that stopping is the step. That clarity does not come from more thinking, but from the pause in which thinking rests. And that what the mind cannot reach by effort, it finds effortlessly when it is still. Among the many exchanges preserved in the Zen tradition, one of the most famous belongs to the master Nanin and a visiting scholar. The scholar was a man of considerable learning. He had studied the sutras for years. He had debated with teachers across many provinces. He had opinions about emptiness, about the nature of mind, about the proper interpretation of this text and that commentary, and he carried all of these opinions with him the way a traveler carries a heavy pack, proud of its contents and unwilling to set it down. He arrived at Nanin's temple in the afternoon and was invited to sit for tea. The scholar accepted and immediately began to talk. He told Nanin about his studies. He shared his views on the finer points of Buddhist philosophy. He asked questions that were really statements dressed in question marks, the kind of questions designed to display the asker's knowledge rather than to receive anything new. Nanin listened. He nodded at the right moment. He set the kettle on the fire and waited for it to heat. When the water was ready, he poured the tea. He filled the scholar's cup. The tea rose to the brim, and Nanin kept pouring. The tea spilled over the rim, onto the saucer, across the table, and began to drip onto the floor. The scholar watched in astonishment, then alarm. "Stop," he said. "The cup is full. No more will go in." Nanin set down the kettle and looked at him. "Like this cup," he said, "you are full of your own opinions and conclusions. How can anything new enter until you first empty your cup?" The scholar opened his mouth to reply and then closed it. For perhaps the first time in a very long time, he had nothing to say. And in that silence, something shifted. Not because Nanin had given him a teaching, but because the silence itself was the teaching. The pause in which the talking stopped was the very emptiness the scholar had been theorizing about for years. The overflowing cup carries a teaching that goes beyond intellectual humility, though it includes that. It points to something physical, something felt. The mind that is full of plans, full of worries, full of opinions, full of the day's residue, has no room for what is actually here. It is so busy processing its existing contents that the present moment cannot get in. Not because the present moment is hidden, but because the cup is already occupied. And the scholar's cup was not full of bad material. His studies were genuine. His questions were intelligent. His years of learning were not wasted. The problem was not what was in the cup. The problem was that the cup had no space left. Even good thinking, when it fills the mind completely, becomes an obstacle to seeing. The very knowledge that was supposed to lead to understanding becomes the thing that blocks it, the way a hand pressed against the eyes blocks the view that was there all along. This is what makes stopping so powerful and so difficult. Stopping is not laziness. It is not giving up. It is not a failure of effort. It is a deliberate act of clearing, an emptying that takes more courage than filling, because filling feels productive and emptying feels like loss. The mind that stops thinking for a moment fears that it is losing something. What will happen if the planning stops? What will happen if the analyzing pauses? What if the problem gets worse while the mind is resting? But the teaching from every corner of the tradition is the same. What was obscured by the thinking becomes visible in the pause. The answer that could not be found through more analysis surfaces on its own when the analyzing stops. The clarity that effort could not produce arrives, unbidden, in the stillness. This is the paradox of clarity. The figuring out mind, for all its speed and sophistication, obscures the very thing it is looking for. It is like stirring a pool to see the bottom. The harder you stir, the muddier the water becomes. Stop stirring, and the mud settles on its own, and the bottom becomes visible without any effort at all. Stopping is not passive. It is the most active form of trust there is. It trusts that the mind, left to settle, will find its own clarity. It trusts that the answer, released from the grip of effort, will surface when it is ready. It trusts that the bottom of the pool is there and has always been there and does not need to be dug for. It only needs the stirring to stop. There is an old folk tale, told across many cultures in different forms, about a man who spent many years working on a distant estate. He had left home young, hired by a wealthy landowner, and labored faithfully for a long time. When his service was finally complete and it was time to return home, he went to the old steward of the estate, expecting his wages. The steward, a monk who managed the estate's affairs, looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You have served well. I can give you your wages in silver, or I can give you 3 pieces of advice instead. Choose one." The man thought about it. He needed the money. His family was waiting. He had been away for years and had nothing to show for it but worn hands and a tired body. But something in the old monk's eyes made him pause. There was a steadiness there, a depth of experience, that made the advice feel valuable in a way he could not explain. "Give me the advice," he said. The monk held up one finger. "First, where you see a quarrel, walk away from it. Do not enter." He held up a second finger. "Second, do not leave a known road for an unknown shortcut." He held up a third. "Third, carry tonight's anger to tomorrow. Never act on anger the same night it arises." Then the monk handed him a sealed loaf of bread. "Do not break this open until you are sitting at your own table with your family." The man took the loaf, wrapped it carefully in his cloth bundle, and set off on the long road home. He walked for days, through villages and fields, across rivers and along ridges, sleeping under trees and in the barns of strangers. The road was long, and many times he wondered whether 3 pieces of advice were worth the wages he had given up. On the first night, he stopped at a house in a village and asked for lodging. The family took him in, but before long the husband and wife began to argue. Voices rose. Dishes rattled. The man remembered the first piece of advice, wished them a peaceful evening, and went next door to sleep. In the morning, he learned that the argument had turned dangerous in the night. The first counsel had kept him safe. On the second day, he met a fellow traveler who suggested a shortcut through the hills. The path was narrow and overgrown, but the traveler insisted it would save half a day's walking. The man remembered the second piece of advice and stayed on the main road. He later learned that the shortcut had led through unstable ground. The second counsel had kept him safe. On the third evening, after weeks of walking, the man reached his own village at dusk. He had not seen his home in many years. He walked through the familiar lanes, heart pounding, and came to the window of his house. Inside, in the firelight, he could see his wife sitting at the table. And beside her sat a young man he did not recognize. A tall, strong young man, comfortable at the hearth, sitting close to her, laughing at something she had said. The man's blood surged. His hand went to the door. Everything inside him wanted to throw it open, to shout, to demand an explanation. The years of absence, the loneliness of the road, the faithfulness of his labor, all of it compressed into one white-hot moment of fury. And then the third counsel returned. Carry tonight's anger to tomorrow. Never act on anger the same night it arises. He lowered his hand. He stood in the dark for a long time, breathing. Then he knocked on the door. His wife opened it and cried out with joy. She threw her arms around him, and the young man at the table stood up, and the man saw, in the firelight, his own face looking back at him, 20 years younger. It was his son. The boy he had left as a small child, now grown, now tall, now sitting at the family hearth where he belonged. They sat together that evening, the three of them, and the man broke open the sealed loaf. Inside, folded carefully into the bread, were his wages. Every coin he had earned, saved by the old monk and hidden where they would not be lost or stolen on the road. He sat at his own table, with his son and his wife, holding the coins and the bread, and he understood the 3 pieces of advice. The quarrel avoided. The shortcut refused. The anger carried to the morning, where it found nothing left to do. The third counsel is the one that matters most for tonight. Carry tonight's anger to tomorrow. It is not asking the man to suppress his feeling or pretend it does not exist. The fury was real. The sight through the window was genuinely shocking. Every instinct in him was pushing toward action, and the action would have been a catastrophe. What the counsel asks for is one pause, one night, one gap between the surge and the act. And in that gap, everything changes. The fury does not need to be resolved or argued with or understood. It just needs to be held for a few hours, carried to the morning, where the light reveals what the dark concealed. A son, not a stranger. A homecoming, not a betrayal. The same facts, seen in the clarity that only the pause could provide. If he had not paused, if the surge had carried him through the door an instant sooner, the homecoming would have been a catastrophe. The words he would have spoken could not have been unsaid. The accusation would have hung in the room like smoke, and everything that followed, the joy of reunion, the shared bread, the coins hidden in the loaf, would have been poisoned by the first 10 seconds. All of it, an entire life's worth of waiting and faithfulness and hope, would have been broken by one moment of action, without pause. This is the one breath gap carried to its fullest expression. In ordinary life, the gap is usually smaller, one breath before speaking, one pause before sending a message, one moment of stillness before reacting to a piece of news. But the principle is the same. The surge wants to act immediately. The pause lets the surge pass through, and on the other side of it, the situation is almost always different from what it appeared to be in the heat of the first moment. The break that Nyanaponika Thera described is not a suppression. It is a trust that what is obscured by the surge will become visible in the pause. A trust that the clarity the mind cannot find by working harder will arrive on its own when the working stops. A trust that the bottom of the pool is there and has always been there and will become visible as soon as the stirring ends. All three counsels in the folktale are versions of this same trust. Where you see a quarrel, walk away. Trust that the quarrel will resolve or reveal itself without your presence. Do not leave the known road for the unknown shortcut. Trust that the longer path is the safer one, even when patience is running thin. Carry tonight's anger to tomorrow. Trust that what the dark conceals, the morning will reveal. Each counsel asks the same thing. Pause. Resist the pull of the immediate. Let the situation unfold for one more moment before acting. And in each case, the pause saved the man from a disaster that haste would have delivered. The quarrel that turned dangerous. The shortcut through unstable ground. The son mistaken for a stranger. In ordinary life, the pauses are smaller, but the principle does not change. The message typed in anger that sits unsent for an hour and looks different when reread. The argument rehearsed in the car, sharp and righteous, that softens by the time the driver reaches the front door and sees the tired face of the person inside. The decision made at 3 a.m, urgent and final, that loses its urgency by breakfast. Each of these is the third counsel in miniature. Each is a gap in which the surge passes and the facts become visible again. The mind does not like the gap. The gap feels like hesitation, like weakness, like missing the moment. But the gap is where clarity lives. It is where the sun is recognized. It is where the bread is broken. It is where the wages are found. So tonight, if there is nothing else to take from this stretch of the journey, take the pause. One breath, one moment of not doing. Not because the mind needs to be disciplined, but because the mind, resting for one breath, finds what it was looking for. Everything that has been said tonight, every teaching and every story, comes down to this. Stop for one moment and see what is already here. The breath is here. The body is here. The room is here. Nothing else is required. Let that be enough and rest in it, and we will go on when you are ready. The Tibetan master Nyoshul Ken Rinpoche left behind a passage that reads like a lullaby for the exhausted mind. He wrote, "Rest in natural great peace. This exhausted mind, beaten helplessly by karma and neurotic thoughts, like the relentless fury of the pounding waves in the infinite ocean of samsara. Rest in natural great peace." There is one word in that passage that holds the whole teaching. Not rest, though that matters. Not peace, though that matters too. The word is natural. Natural great peace. Peace that is not manufactured. Peace that is not earned or built or achieved through effort. Peace that is the mind's own ground, always present beneath the waves, uncovered rather than created, waiting rather than withheld. Everything we have traveled through tonight has been moving toward this. The seeing and the naming and the welcoming and the stopping were never about producing peace. They were about clearing away what hid it. The wheel was hiding it. The proliferation was hiding it. The verdicts were hiding it. And now, with the hiding seen for what it is, what remains is what was here all along. In the Pali Canon, there is the story of a monk named Sona. Before he entered the monastic life, Sona had been a musician, a skilled and accomplished player of the lute. He was known across the region for the beauty of his playing. He understood instinctively how to coax a melody from the strings, how to let a phrase linger, how to build a song from silence to fullness and bring it home again. Music had been the center of his life, and he was very good at it. He came from a wealthy family and had never known hardship. When he gave up that life to follow the Buddha's teaching, he brought the same intensity to practice that he had once brought to his music. He would practice walking meditation for hours without rest, pacing the same path until his body ached beyond measure. He sat in stillness until he could no longer feel his limbs. He pushed himself relentlessly, day after day, with the same fierce determination that had once made him a master of the lute. But nothing came of it. The peace he was seeking did not arrive. The understanding he was striving for remained out of reach. The harder he pushed, the further it seemed to recede. It was as if the effort itself was creating the distance, as if the thing he was reaching for moved back precisely as fast as he reached. And after months of this punishing effort, Sona sat alone in his meditation hut one evening and thought, perhaps this is not for me. Perhaps the monastic life is a mistake. Perhaps I should return to my old life, where at least my effort produced results. At least when I practiced the lute, the strings answered. Here, the silence answers with more silence. The Buddha, who was staying on a nearby hill, became aware of Sona's state of mind and came to visit him. He sat down beside the exhausted monk and asked a simple question. Sona, before you came here, you were a fine player of the lute, were you not? Yes, Lord. And when the strings of your lute were pulled too tight, was the sound beautiful? Could you play well? Sona shook his head. No. When the strings were too tight, the sound was sharp and harsh. The strings could snap. And when the strings were too loose? When there was no tension at all. Then there was no sound. The strings were slack and dead. But when the strings were tuned to the middle, neither too tight nor too loose, then the lute could sing. Yes, Sona said. Then it was beautiful. The Buddha looked at him. It is the same with effort and with the mind. When the effort is too fierce, it leads to restlessness and strain. When the effort is too lax, it leads to dullness. Find the middle pitch, Sona. Tune your effort the way you would tune a string, and the music will come. Something in Sona settled. It was not a dramatic awakening. It was more like the sound of a string finding its note, a slight adjustment that changes everything. He had been pulling so hard for so long that he had forgotten what ease felt like. He had believed that the peace he was seeking was somewhere beyond the next effort, the next push, the next hour of walking. And the Buddha had shown him, with an image from his own life, that the peace was not beyond anything. It was in the tuning. It was in the easing of the pull. It was in the natural pitch that the string already knew, if only the hand would stop forcing it. The lute had taught Sona everything he needed to know years before he ever sat down to meditate. He had known, as a musician, that a string forced too tight produces a sound that hurts to hear. He had known that a string left too slack produces no sound at all. He had spent years finding the middle pitch, the place where the string vibrates freely and the music emerges without strain. And then he had entered the monastic life and forgotten everything his hands already knew. He had pulled the strings of his practice tight enough to snap, and when they did not produce the music he wanted, he had pulled harder. The Buddha's teaching was not new information. It was a remembering. It was the musician being reminded of what the musician already understood, that beauty is not produced by force, that the note is found, not made, that the hand's job is to bring the string to its natural pitch and then to get out of the way. Sona resolved to practice with ease. And in time, with the strings tuned to the middle, the music came. This is the heart of what Nyoshul Khen Rinpoche meant by natural. The peace is not something the mind produces. It is what the mind sounds like when it is properly tuned. The waves on the surface, the relentless fury of thought and habit and projection are real. They crash and they pound and they exhaust. But beneath them, always, is the ocean itself. And the ocean is still. Consider the ocean for a moment. On the surface, where the wind touches the water, there is constant motion. Waves rise and fall. Foam churns. The surface is never the same from one moment to the next. But 10 feet down, the water is calmer. 20 feet down, it is almost still. And at the bottom, in the depths, the ocean rests in a silence that no storm can reach. The waves on the surface are real. They are powerful. They can capsize a boat and reshape a coastline. But they are not the ocean. They are what happens on the surface of the ocean. The depths were never disturbed. The mind is like this. The thoughts that crash across its surface are real. They carry force. They shape experience. But they are surface phenomena. Beneath them, the awareness that knows them is present, undisturbed, the way the deep ocean is present, beneath even the fiercest storm. And the peace that Nyoshul Khen Rinpoche pointed to is not the absence of waves. It is the remembering of the depths. Practice does not create the stillness. Practice uncovers it. Every moment of seeing the wheel, every flip of the coin, every return greeted with warmth, every naming of the spin has been a loosening of the strings, a small adjustment toward the natural pitch. And at that pitch, what is found is not something new. It is something that was always there, obscured only by the effort to reach it. This is why the instruction is rest. Not work harder. Not meditate more fiercely. Not try to achieve peace. Rest. In natural great peace. Let the strings find their own pitch. Let the mud settle. Let the waves be waves, and know that beneath them, the ocean has not moved. The word natural carries one more teaching. Peace is not a reward for good practice. It is not something that arrives after a certain number of hours of meditation or a certain level of spiritual development. It is the mind's own ground, present from the beginning, present right now, present in the middle of the worst storm the surface can produce. A newborn child resting in sleep is resting in natural great peace. An old woman breathing slowly in a warm room is resting in natural great peace. The peace was never added. It was never earned. It was always the ground, and the practice was always just the remembering. The Zen master Bankai, who lived and taught in 17th century Japan, was approached one day by a student in great distress. "Master," the student said, "I have a terrible temper. It comes over me without warning, and when it does, I say and do things I regret. I have tried to control it for years. I have sat with it. I have argued with it. I have made promises to myself that this time will be different, and then the temper comes again and the promises dissolve. It is my nature, and it shames me." Bankai listened. He did not rush to reassure. He sat with the confession as if weighing it carefully. Then he said, "Show me this temper." The student looked confused. "I cannot show it to you now. It is not here at the moment." It comes on its own, without invitation. Then it is not your nature, Bankei said. If it were truly your nature, you could produce it at any time, the way you can produce your hand or your voice. What is truly yours is always available to you. But this temper comes and goes. It visits you like weather visits a mountain. The mountain does not become the storm. The student sat very still. Something in those words reached a place that years of self-criticism had never touched. You are the mountain, Bankei said. The storm passes over you. It always has. It always will. But you are not the storm. The student carried those words with him for the rest of his life. The temper still came. It still arrived without warning, still surged through his body like a sudden weather front. But he no longer believed it was who he was. He greeted it the way one greets a familiar storm, with respect for its power and no confusion about its nature. It was weather. It would pass. And the mountain beneath it, the awareness that watched the storm come and watched the storm go, remained where it had always been. This is a fitting place to arrive at the end of tonight's journey, because it gathers together two things that might seem to be in tension: the acknowledgement that difficult thoughts and feelings will keep coming, and the assurance that they do not define what we are. There is a saying from India, even a 93-year-old saint is not safe. You are just one thought away. One thought away from getting caught again. One thought away from the wheel starting up, the proliferation mushrooming, the verdict hardening, the phantom returning. This is true, and it is humbling, and it is good to know, because it removes any expectation of perfection. There is no arriving at a place where the mind stops producing its weather. There is only the ongoing practice of recognizing the weather for what it is and letting it pass without mistaking it for the mountain. But the saying works in both directions. If you are one thought away from getting caught, you are also one thought away from being free. One moment of seeing. One flip of the coin. One I see you, Mara. One pause, one breath, one return, greeted with warmth. The distance between lost and here is always the same, one moment. And that moment is always available. It was available to the woman on the winter road, and to the boy in the dormitory, and to the bride in the cellar. It was available to Sona with his aching body, and to the man standing outside his own door in the dark. It is available right now. This is the freedom the whole evening has been pointing toward. Not the freedom of a mind that has stopped producing weather. That mind does not exist, not even in a 93-year-old saint. The freedom of a mind that knows the weather for what it is. That greets the storm and does not become it. That gets caught and returns and gets caught again and returns again, each time with a little more ease, a little more humor, a little more of the warmth that Sengai offered in the cold. So tonight, as we reach the end of what we have been exploring together, there is nothing left to do. No technique to practice. No insight to hold on to. No state to achieve or maintain. The strings can be laid down. The effort can be released. Whatever the mind is doing right now, whether it is spinning or still, busy or empty, close to sleep or wide awake, it can be allowed to do exactly what it is doing. There is no wrong way to be in this moment. Beneath whatever is happening on the surface, there is a peace that was never disturbed. It has been here since before the first word was spoken tonight, and it will be here long after the last one fades. It does not need to be found, because it was never lost. It does not need to be protected, because nothing can damage it. It is the natural ground of the mind, and resting in it is not something that requires skill or effort or practice. It requires only the willingness to stop reaching for one moment and to let what is already here be enough. Rest in natural great peace. That was Nyoshul Ken Rinpoche's instruction, and it is the simplest instruction there is. The mind is tired. It has worked hard tonight and every night, and the rest it is being offered now is not a reward for good work. It is what was waiting underneath the work the whole time, like the ocean beneath the waves, like the mountain beneath the storm, like the lute's true note beneath the tightened strings. Let the body be held by whatever is beneath it. Let the breath find its own rhythm, without direction, without effort. Let the mind do whatever it does, and let the awareness beneath the mind rest, open and easy in its own nature. If thoughts come, let them come. If they go, let them go. They are weather. The mountain does not need to do anything about the weather. It has been standing here since before the storms began, and it will be standing here when they are done. The lute's true note is sounding. The ocean is still. The mountain is at rest. And you, wherever you are, however the mind is moving or not moving, are already home. There is nothing more to say. Stay here as long as you like. Tonight we began with a mind on a wheel, grinding in the dark, suffering futures that had not arrived. And we followed a single thread through that spinning, the thread of seeing. Seeing the wheel, seeing the flip, seeing the return and greeting it with warmth, seeing the chain of proliferation and the verdicts it builds, seeing the phantom, the visitor, the old familiar thought, and recognizing it for what it is. Seeing that awakeness is not a distant achievement, but the other side of this breath. Seeing that the pause reveals what the effort conceals. And seeing, at last, that beneath all the spinning there is a peace that was never disturbed, a peace that does not need to be earned, only uncovered. Nothing from tonight needs to be remembered. Nothing needs to be practiced or perfected or carried forward as a task. If all of it fades by morning, that is perfectly fine. The only thing that matters is this: the next time the mind begins to spin, and it will, one small moment of noticing is enough. One flip, one breath, one return, greeted kindly. That moment is always available. It is always one step away, and it is always enough. Wherever you are tonight, may the mind rest easy. May the body be at peace. And may the awareness that was here before any of these words were spoken carry you gently into whatever comes next. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Midnight Monk.